Picture a city of 500,000 people, every single one of them asleep. Now picture one person standing in the cold outside their windows, armed with a 14-foot bamboo pole, and the knowledge that if those people don't wake up in the next 2 hours, children will go hungry. That person is not a ghost, not a watchman, not a priest. That person has a job title, a client list, a rate card, and blisters on their palms from 6 months of doing this, every single night of their lives. That person is called a knocker-up, and tonight, that person is you. I make these history stories, and I genuinely don't know if you're listening to this at 3 a.m. because you have the soul of a Victorian factory worker, or because my voice is the auditory equivalent of a weighted blanket, or because you have insomnia and you've run out of other options. Any of those is fine. All of those are fine. But I'll tell you this, the story I'm about to put you inside is specifically about sleep, about the value of sleep, about the violence of being torn out of it, about the people whose entire livelihood depended on destroying your rest. So there's something very strange and very perfect about listening to this particular episode right now, in the dark, on the edge of unconsciousness. Because in a very real sense, you're experiencing what every factory worker in Manchester, England, in the autumn of 1882 experienced in reverse. They had someone forcing them awake. You have me helping you drift down. 2 sides of the same coin. One city, 500,000 people, and the eternal problem of getting the human body to do what the clock demands. So, get comfortable. Here we go. It is 3:15 in the morning on a Tuesday in November 1882, and you are already late. Not catastrophically late, not fire and brimstone late, but you should have been on Pollard Street 7 minutes ago, and instead you're standing at the corner of Ancoats Lane trying to get the wire end of your pole to stop catching on the gap in your coat pocket, and your fingers are so cold you can barely feel them. And the gas lamp on the corner is doing that thing it does in the cold, where the flame shrinks down to a pale blue tremor that gives you almost no light at all. You get the pole free, you hitch it up under your arm and you start walking. The pole is 14 feet long, bamboo wrapped in oilcloth at the handle end so it doesn't split your skin in the cold, with a coil of stiff wire twisted around the tip like a bottle brush. That wire end is the business part. When you tap it against a window, against the glass of a second-floor bedroom in one of these terraced houses where the mill workers sleep 4 to a room and the walls are so thin you can hear the family next door arguing through the plaster, it makes a sound. Not a loud sound. A scratching, rattling, precise sound, like a very insistent mouse, like a message in a code that only sleeping people understand. A sound that says, "It's time. Get up. The mill doesn't wait. You've been doing this for 6 months. Since the May Day bank holiday, when Mrs. Hadfield took you on at 2 shillings a week to cover the Ancoats rounds, while a nephew recovered from a broken wrist. The nephew's wrist healed, but Mrs. Hadfield kept you anyway, because her nephew, she said, had the touch of an elephant and woke the whole street when he meant to wake one person, and that was bad for business in ways she didn't have the patience to explain. You have the touch. She told you that in the 2nd week, which was the closest thing to a compliment you'd heard since you left Cheshire. 47 clients. That's your number. 47 names on a list that Mrs. Hadfield keeps in a ledger the size of a Bible, written in her cramped, slanting hand with the wake time and the price, and 2 notes per client. One about their peculiarities, and one about what happens if they're late. The what happens if note is the important one. Thomas Ridley, number 4 on the list, 4:15 a.m, 3 pence a week. What happens if late? docked a quarter day's pay by the overlooker at Murray's Mill. He can't afford a quarter day. He's got 4 children and his wife is expecting a 5th in February. Grace Marsden, number 11, 4 a.m, 2p a week. What happens if late? She's already been warned twice by the overseer. 3rd time she's out. She came to Manchester from Lincolnshire and she doesn't have anywhere else to go. You carry these notes in your head. Every knock you make, you're not just tapping a window. You're holding someone's livelihood in your hands. Their rent, their food, their children's boots. They have trusted you. This 19-year-old boy from a farm village in Cheshire, who smells faintly of sheep even now after 6 months of city living, with the most critical 15 seconds of their entire day. You do not take that lightly. The street is empty ahead of you. Pollard Street at 3:15 in the morning looks like the inside of a held breath. The gas lamps throw circles of yellow-orange light on the cobblestones, and between those circles there is absolute darkness. The terraced houses on either side are identical, 2 up, 2 down, dark brick that has absorbed a century's worth of coal smoke and now gives it back as a kind of greasy blackness that makes the walls look wet even when they're not. The chimneys are cold at this hour. No one wastes coal on a fire that burns while you sleep. You'll light the fire when you get up. You'll light it if you get up in time to light it, which is why I'm here, which is why any of this exists. You count the houses from the corner. 1, 2, 3, 4, number 4, Thomas Ridley. You raise the pole and tap 3 times on the window, the wire spiral catching the glass with that particular scratching rattle that is the sound of 5 o'clock in the morning, the sound of the industrial north, the sound of a city that runs on human muscle and has to get that muscle moving before the sun does. 3 taps. Wait. Listen. There's a skill to the listening. You're not listening for a voice or a footstep. You're listening for the specific quality of the darkness inside the window changing. The slight thickening of presence behind glass that tells you a sleeping body has registered your message, even if the conscious mind hasn't caught up yet. Nothing. 3 more taps, slightly harder, the wire scraping instead of just touching. A yellow light blooms in the corner of the upstairs window. Candle, not gas lamp. Thomas Ridley can't afford a gas lamp in the bedroom. The candle wobbles toward the window. A face appears behind the glass. Thomas Ridley at 4:15 in the morning. Unshaven, hair pressed flat on one side, eyes that are open, but not yet in possession of a working mind. He holds up 3 fingers. 3 minutes. You nod, step back, make a mark in your head, and move on. You do not wait to confirm. You can't wait. There are 46 more people on this list, and waiting 3 minutes for each of them would mean your last client gets knocked at 8 in the morning, and you might as well be banging a drum while they serve breakfast. This is the fundamental mathematics of the knocker-up trade. You operate on faith. You tap the window, you see the light, you leave. What happens next is between the person and their own willpower, and their own fear of what happens if they don't get up, and the sound of that wire on the glass still scratching at the inside of their skull, even as they're pulling on their trousers in the dark. You've planted the seed. Whether it grows is not your problem, except when it is. And that's the thing that Mrs. Hadfield tried to explain to you in the first week. Sitting in her kitchen at 5 in the afternoon when you'd finished your rounds and come back for tea, and she was already planning the next night's schedule in her ledger with a stub of pencil behind her ear. She said, "Your job is not to wake people up. Your job is to make the waking possible." The difference sounds small, but it isn't. You give them the chance. What they do with it is theirs. But here's the thing, she said, tapping the pencil against the ledger. Here's the thing that will keep you up at night if you let it, and you mustn't let it. Some of them won't get up, some of them will hear you and turn over, some of them will sleep straight through your knock in a way that no human being should be able to sleep through, because they are so exhausted from the day before and the day before that and every day for the last year that their body has made a unilateral decision to simply stop responding to external information. And when that happens, she said, when that happens and they're late and they lose their job, it will feel like your fault. You'll go back through the knock in your head. Should I have tapped harder? Should I have used the rattle? Should I have stayed until I heard footsteps? And the answer, she said, looking at you very steadily over the rim of her teacup, the answer is no. You did your job. They didn't do theirs. There's a contract here. You uphold your end every single night, rain or ice, or fog or fever. And if they don't uphold their end, that's not on you. She seemed very certain about this. You are not yet certain about this. Move on. Window 5. Martha Booth. Pisa at Ancoats Mill number 3. 4:20 a.m. 2 pence a week. She's 41 years old and has been doing the same job since she was 9, which means she has spent 32 years reaching her arms into moving machinery to piece broken cotton threads back together. Her face inches from spindles that are turning fast enough to take a finger off. Sometimes do take a finger off, have taken 2 of hers so far. She wakes up the moment your pole shadow crosses the window. You're not sure she sleeps properly at all. Number 5 lights up before you've even finished the first tap. You move on. Number 6, number 7, number 8. And here is where I need to stop us for a moment, because I realise I've dropped you into this world, and it's 3:15 in the morning and it's very cold and you have a bamboo pole and a list of names, but I haven't explained the thing that makes all of this extraordinary, the thing that makes this entire profession exist, the thing that this whole night is really about. And that thing is simple. It is this. For most of human history, nobody knew what time it was. I need you to really sit with that. Not just know it intellectually the way you know facts you've half absorbed and filed away. Really feel it. For most of the time that human beings have existed on this planet, from the first fire-sitting, flint-chipping, mammoth-hunting ancestors, right through to your great-great-great-grandmother doing her washing by hand in a stone basin, there was no such thing as a reliable, personal, portable mechanism for knowing what time it was. The sun came up, the sun went down. In between, you did what you could and guessed the rest. If you needed to be somewhere at a specific moment, someone told you what the sky would look like at that moment, and you watched the sky, and when it looked like that, you went. That was it. That was the entire system for hundreds of thousands of years, and you got by, because you had to, because the alternative was dying. You learned to read the light, the shadows, the birds, the temperature of the air. You learn that when the first light comes from the east, you have about an hour before the sun is fully up. You learned that when the shadows of trees point this way, it is noon. You learn to feel time in your body the way you feel hunger or thirst. Not precisely, not reliably, but well enough for a life that moved at the pace of seasons rather than minutes. Then everything changed. Not all at once. Nothing in history changes all at once, despite what the textbooks would like you to think. But in increments, in small disasters and small solutions, the world learned to count the hours, and every time it learned, the increments got smaller. Hours became half hours became minutes became seconds, and with every subdivision, With every new unit of time that humans carved out of the formless flow of duration, the demand on human beings to show up at a precise moment in that formless flow got stricter and less forgiving. And so the problem of waking up at a specific time became the central problem of industrial civilization. And the solutions to that problem are some of the strangest, most beautiful, most desperate things that human beings have ever invented. You are one of those solutions. You're walking through the dark with your pole, and you are, in the most literal sense, holding time together for this city. Number 9, number 10, number 11. Grace Marsden's window. Number 11 on the list. 4 o'clock exactly. And you're on time now. Have gotten back on schedule somewhere around number 7. The window is dark. You tap. You wait. You tap again. You wait. A minute passes. You tap a third time. Harder. The wire spirals scratching loud enough that you wince a little, hoping no one on either side of Grace Marsden is a light sleeper or a complainer, because Mrs. Hadfield has had words before with neighbours who object to the tapping, and she does not enjoy having those words, and she definitely makes you hear about them afterward. The light comes, late, slower than it should be. Grace Marsden's candle takes a long time to appear at the window. When it does, her face looks wrong, even through the glass at night from 14 feet below. Not wrong in the way that all faces look wrong at 4 in the morning, which is stripped of performance, stripped of the careful arrangements of muscle and expression that we put on when we know we're being seen, wrong in a different way. Pale wrong, compressed wrong. The face of someone who has been lying in the dark for hours, not sleeping, just existing in the particular misery of a body that is too exhausted to sleep but too afraid to get up. She holds up a hand, 5 fingers, 5 minutes. You nod, move on. But you make a different mark in your head for Grace Marsden, a mark that says, watch that one, number 12. Number 13. This is how a knocker-up thinks, in lists and marks and the micro-observations of a person who sees 47 faces in their most unguarded moment every single night. You know things about these people that their wives don't know. You know who sleeps on which side of the bed by where the candle moves. You know who has nightmares by the way they sometimes come to the window already breathing hard and sweating in the November cold. You know who gets up with their partner and who gets up alone. You know from the position of candles and the sounds that filter through the thin brick walls, which families are struggling and which are merely coping, which marriages are warm and which are purely functional arrangements between 2 people who need each other's wages to pay the rent. You know all of this, and you tell it to no one. That's the other part of Mrs. Hadfield's training that she delivered over 2 weeks of morning tea and pencil stub notes. Confidentiality. These people are trusting you with their most private moment, she said. The moment between sleep and wakefulness. The moment before they put on whatever face they show the world. You see behind that face every single night, and what you see stays with you. You are not a gossip. You're not a spy. You're a professional, and professionals keep their clients' lives private. She said this with the specific authority of a woman who's been keeping 47 families' secrets for almost 3 decades. And you understood it in your gut even before she finished the sentence. The pole rests on your shoulder. Your boots on the cobblestones make the only sound on Pollard Street. The gas lamp on the corner flickers once, twice, then steadies. You think about time. You can't help it. You've been thinking about time since you started this job, because the job is essentially a meditation on time, on what time is, on who owns it, on what it costs to control it. The first people who tried to measure time didn't use clocks. They used the sky, the sun's position, the length of shadows, the angle of light through a window or a hole in a roof. This worked reasonably well for broad purposes. When the shadow is this long, it is time to eat. When the sun reaches that point above the horizon, it is time to bring in the animals. But the sky is unreliable, clouds, seasons. The way the sun's path changes through the year so that the midday shadow in December is 3 times longer than the midday shadow in June. The sky is a clock for people who don't need to be anywhere at a specific time. It's a living clock, always moving, always true to itself but never the same twice, and completely useless if you're trying to schedule a fleet of ships or coordinate an army or run a factory shift at 5:30 in the morning. So people built other clocks. The oldest ones were water clocks. Clepsydra, the Greeks called them, from the Greek for water thief, which is a wonderful name when you think about it, because that's exactly what they were. They stole time from water, measured it in drops and flows and the slow sinking of a float inside a chamber. The Egyptians were using water clocks around 1500 years before the birth of Christ, which is roughly 3,500 years ago, which is the kind of number that the mind refuses to actually process. So let's say instead they were using water clocks when the pyramids were already old, when the Sphinx was already missing its nose, when Egypt was already a civilization with a long history and elaborate bureaucracies and a priestly class obsessed with the ordering of time. The Egyptian clepsydra was a stone bowl with a small hole near the base. Water dripped through the hole at a measurable, predictable rate. Inside the bowl, lines were carved at intervals to mark the hours as the water level dropped. In the day, you read the sunlight. At night, you read the water. The priests in the temple complexes kept these vessels and tended them carefully, refilling them when they ran dry, adjusting for the seasonal change in the night's length, maintaining the measurement of time as a sacred duty, because in Egypt, in that world, time was not an administrative convenience. It was divine. The gods existed in time. The rituals had to happen at the right moments, or the correct relationships between the human and divine worlds could not be maintained. Get the hour wrong and the prayer was hollow. Get it wrong enough and the sun might not rise tomorrow. That's how much was riding on knowing what time it was. Your 14 feet of bamboo pole and a wire spiral in the dark, and you are the direct heir of those priests with their stone bowls. Number 14. Number 15. Number 16. Number 16 is a man named Arthur Capper, who works the night shift at the Manchester Gasworks and needs waking at 2:45 in the morning, which is technically before your official round start. But Mrs. Hadfield has a soft spot for the gasworks men because, she says, without them there'd be no gas lamps, and without gas lamps she'd be walking these streets in the absolute dark. So Arthur Capper gets his knock at 2:45 as a kind of professional courtesy to an industry that makes the profession possible. He is always awake before you knock. Every single time, without exception, you raise your pole and the window is already glowing, the candle already lit, Arthur Capper watching for you from behind the glass. You used to find this slightly unnerving, a face in a dark window before you've made a sound. Then you figured it out. Arthur Capper has been waking at 2:30 every morning for 22 years. His body has simply absorbed the schedule. It doesn't need a signal anymore. The clock is inside him now, sewn into his sleep, and he wakes because that's what he does at 2:30, the same way your heart beats and your lungs breathe, without asking permission and without needing to be told. There's a term for it. Circadian rhythm, from the Latin circa dies, approximately a day. The internal clock that runs inside every living thing, plants and insects and animals and human beings alike. The roughly 24-hour cycle that governs when you're tired and when you're alert, when your body temperature peaks and when it drops, when your digestion is active and when it's resting. It's regulated by light primarily, by the signals your eyes send to a tiny cluster of neurons in your brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus, which is the most important structure you've never heard of, which receives information about daylight and uses it to set the timing of every biological process in your body. When there's light in the morning, your body starts producing cortisol, the alertness hormone, the one that opens your eyes and tells your muscles to engage. When it's dark in the evening, your body starts producing melatonin, the sleep hormone, the one that closes your eyes and drags you down into the soft, dark places where consciousness dissolves. Arthur Capper's suprachiasmatic nucleus has reset itself through 2 decades of night shifts to treat 2:30 in the morning as morning. His cortisol spike happens at 2:30. His melatonin drops at 2:30. His body, in the most literal physiological sense, believes that 2:30 is dawn. You don't know any of these words yet. They won't be in common use for another century, but you understand the concept because you've watched Arthur Capper for 6 months, watched him watching for you from the already lit window, and you've thought about what it would take for a human body to change its own internal schedule to that degree. You've thought about the kind of commitment, repeated 10,000 times across 22 years, that would be required to make the impossible normal. You tap his window anyway. Professional courtesy. He gives you a slow nod from behind the glass. You move on. The Romans had a more sophisticated relationship with time than the Egyptians, in the way that civilizations tend to develop a more sophisticated relationship with anything they decide is important. They divided the day into 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of darkness, which sounds reasonable until you realize that this means the hours themselves change length with the seasons. A summer daylight hour was longer than a winter daylight hour. A summer night hour was shorter than a winter one. This made sense if you thought about time as a property of the sun rather than a property of the universe. The sun gives you the day. You divide it into 12 equal parts. Those parts are therefore defined by the sun, not by any independent standard. If the sun gives you more day in summer, your hours get longer. Simple. This worked for a civilization that was primarily agrarian, that regulated its life by harvests and festivals and the long rhythms of agriculture. It worked less well for a civilization that was trying to schedule the movements of armies across multiple time zones, or coordinate the administration of an empire that stretched from Hadrian's Wall in the north of Britain to the deserts of Africa and the hills of Syria. You can't easily coordinate an empire if your hours in Rome are different lengths than your hours in Alexandria. You can't write a letter saying "meet me at the 3rd hour" and have that mean the same thing to the recipient 2,000 miles away if the 3rd hour in Rome is winter short and the 3rd hour in Alexandria is near equatorial standard. The Romans solved this problem the way the Romans solved most problems, which is to say they threw engineering at it and didn't worry too much about elegance. They built sundials all over the empire, tens of thousands of them, calibrated to the latitude of each location, which at least ensured that if you said the 3rd hour to someone in the same city, they'd know what you meant. They built increasingly complex water clocks with bells and whistles, sometimes literally with bells, mechanisms that struck a note at each hour so that people who were indoors or awake at night could still know roughly what time it was. They stationed water clock keepers at important public locations, the forum, the baths, the military barracks. People whose job was to maintain the flow of water in the vessel and announce the hours to anyone nearby. Water clock keeper. It's a job title that sounds like it was invented by a bureaucracy that had run out of things to label, but it was a real position held by real people, and it was in a direct line of descent from the Egyptian temple priests with their stone bowls and their conviction that time belonged to the gods. The transition from sacred to civic was gradual and invisible, the way these things always are. At some point, the priest's job of maintaining the divine order of time became a city official's job of maintaining the practical order of the working day, and nobody particularly noticed the difference because the function was the same. Make sure people know what time it is so they can be where they need to be. You tap your pole on number 17's window and think, I am a water clock keeper, I am a clepsydra, I am the hole in the stone vessel through which time drips. This thought makes you feel simultaneously more important and more absurd, which is a feeling you've grown used to in the 6 months of this job. Number 17, number 18, number 19. The cold is settling deeper now. It started in your fingertips around 2:30 and has been working its way inward since then, up your fingers, into your palms, into your wrists. Your wool coat is doing what it can, which is not much against a Manchester November that has decided tonight to come with a wind off the Pennines, that has been picking up speed since sundown and carries with it the specific damp cold of moorland, the kind of cold that isn't just temperature but is also moisture, that gets into the weave of your clothes and stays there. You've learned since coming to Manchester that cold here is a different animal than cold in Cheshire. In Cheshire, the cold was open. It came at you directly and you dealt with it directly. In Manchester, the cold bounces off the brick and cobblestones and finds you from 4 directions at once. It pools in the alleys, it settles on the streets, and the smell. You should talk about the smell, because it's important and it's everywhere. And if you're going to understand what it was like to be alive in this city at this moment in history, you have to include the smell. Even at 3 a.m, even when the factories are quiet and the workers are theoretically sleeping. Manchester in November 1882 smells of coal smoke, the particular acrid sweetness of burning coal that hangs in the air so permanently it has become the air, the baseline, the thing all other smells are measured against. Underneath that, wet brick and horse dung and the particular sourness of raw cotton, and the chemical smell from the dyeing works on the far side of the Irk River, which on bad nights reaches all the way over here and makes your eyes water. And underneath all of that, the foundational smell of the city itself, which is best described as the smell of 200,000 people living in close proximity without adequate sewage or ventilation, or any real commitment to personal hygiene beyond what's strictly necessary to function. It's not a vile smell, it's just an intensely human one, concentrated, dense. The smell of lives pressed together so tightly that there is no air that hasn't passed through someone else's lungs recently. You've stopped noticing it mostly. That's what happens. The brain adapts. The neurons that fire when you first smell something stop firing as enthusiastically when you smell it again, and again, until eventually they barely fire at all and the smell becomes invisible. This is why people who live near a tannery can eat dinner 3 feet from a vat of rotting hide without losing their appetite. It's why people who work in the dyeing sheds don't notice the chemical fumes that would knock a visitor flat in minutes. Adaptation. The brain protecting itself from drowning in information it can't do anything about. But some mornings, some very cold mornings, when the wind shifts and brings in clean air from the direction of the park, you get a sudden contrast. A gulp of something that has no coal smoke in it, no factory smell, no compressed humanity. And in that gulp, for about 3 seconds, you can smell Manchester as it actually is. All of it. The full weight of it. And it's staggering. It's the smell of the Industrial Revolution, which is one of the most significant events in human history, compressed into a geography and experienced in your sinuses. And then your brain adapts again and it disappears. Number 20, number 21. You're moving through an older part of the district now, streets that were laid out before the mills arrived, streets that still have the occasional tree growing in a gap between houses, though the trees here are sick trees, coal-blackened, their bark stained permanent grey, their leaves in summer a dusty green that never quite achieves the colour it's reaching for. Even the nature here has adapted. Even the trees have given up trying to look like the trees they were supposed to be. The church at the top of Great Ancoat Street has a bell that strikes the quarter hours. You hear it now. 3 strikes for the 3/4, the bell still resonating in the cold air after the strikes are done. The sound travelling in that particular way cold air carries it, clear and clean and further than it should. 4:45. You're on schedule. Number 21 lit up on the second tap. Number 22 is already going to be a problem. You can feel it. Because 22 is John Hennessy, dock worker, and John Hennessy was at the pub until God knows when last night. Because his brother-in-law was visiting from Dublin, and when John Hennessy's brother-in-law visits, the entire universe of John Hennessy's responsibility contracts to a single bright point of Guinness and old songs until someone physically intervenes. You've met the brother-in-law. He came to the door one morning when John Hennessy failed to appear and asked what all the scratching was about, and when you explained, he laughed so hard he had to hold on to the door frame. He thought a knocker-up was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. He asked if you'd do his windows next time he stayed, and you said you didn't cover that street, and he looked genuinely disappointed. This is another thing about the job. People want to talk to you, which is understandable when you think about it. You are often the only other human being they see before they go to work, the only face that isn't the face of someone they live with and have perhaps run out of things to say to. And there's something about the pre-dawn dark that loosens people, makes them talk. The man who comes to his window in his nightshirt and tells you through the glass about the dream he just had. The woman who opens the window an inch to ask if it's going to rain today, as if you have some kind of meteorological authority that comes with the pole. The old man 3 streets over who once kept you talking for 8 minutes while his candle guttered and died in the draught from the open window, telling you about the time he worked at a mill in Salford, before mills were mechanised, when every spindle was turned by hand and the average worker lasted 18 months before the repetitive motion destroyed their wrists. You've learned when to listen and when to walk. You've learnt the specific look of someone who needs the conversation, actually needs it, versus someone who's just stretching the moment before they have to face their day. You've learned to tell the difference. Because empathy is part of this job, whether or not it's in the job description. You are, after all, touching the most vulnerable moment of a person's day. You owe them something for that. 22. John Hennessy. You tap once. Nothing. Tap twice. Nothing. The third tap you do slowly, deliberately, letting the wire spiral drag across the glass in a long building scratch that is specifically designed to penetrate the consciousness of someone who has had 4 pints too many and is sleeping with the boneless abandon of the thoroughly drunk. A light, movement, the sound, muffled through glass and wall, of someone locating the floor from a horizontal position in several stages. The window comes up an inch. You say nothing. This is your policy with John Hennessy. You say nothing and you wait, because if you say anything he'll start talking, and you'll be here until the church bell strikes 4. He looks at you. You look at him. He gives you a very slow nod that carries in it the entire history of his evening and says, I understand. I know. I'm getting up. God help me. You walk away before he changes his mind. The history of the alarm clock, which is really the history of what happens when you need to wake up but there's no one to wake you, can be told in at least a dozen different ways depending on which civilization you start from and which invention you decide matters most. But I want to tell it to you through the monks, the monasteries, because the monasteries are where this whole story, in the Western world at least, really begins, where the need to wake at a precise time becomes so critical, so non-negotiable, so woven into the structure of daily life, that human ingenuity finally produces a solution that doesn't depend on someone else being awake to wake you up. The rule of St. Benedict, written in the 6th century AD, divided the monks' day into 8 canonical hours: matins, lauds, prime, terce, sext, nun, vespers, and compline. Each of these hours was a prescribed time for prayer. Each required the entire community to assemble in the chapel and pray together. Missed the hour and you weren't just late to work, you were failing in your fundamental religious duty, the thing you had taken vows to do, the thing that gave your life its entire meaning and structure. Miss enough hours and you might lose your place in the community. Miss them with any regularity and you might have to have a very serious conversation with the abbot about whether the monastic life was truly your calling. Matins was the worst. Matins happened somewhere between midnight and 2 in the morning, depending on the time of year. The monks had typically been in bed for 3 or 4 hours after compline, the evening prayer. Now they needed to be awake, dressed, assembled, and spiritually prepared to pray. In the absolute dark. In the cold of a stone chapel where the heating was whatever warmth came off the bodies of the assembled community. The solution they developed was the alarm clock, not a mechanical one. Not yet. The medieval alarm clock was a human being. Specifically, it was the sacristan, the monk whose job it was to maintain the sacred objects and schedule of the chapel. The sacristan's job included waking up, on their own, without assistance, at whatever time was required for matins, and then waking everyone else. How the sacristan woke themselves up was a question of personal ingenuity and commitment. Some of them simply didn't sleep very deeply, trained themselves over years into a kind of shallow vigilance that released them at approximately the right moment. Some of them used water clocks, a vessel that dripped through the night and made a noise when it emptied, releasing a mechanism that struck a bell or dropped a weight. Some of them, the historical record implies, simply didn't sleep at all, spending the hours between compline and matins in private prayer or reading, essentially making themselves into human alarm clocks through the application of willpower alone. And then the sacristan would ring the chapel bell. Not a small bell, a proper chapel bell, rung from a rope, filling the entire monastery with a sound that was specifically designed to be impossible to sleep through. The same bell that called the community to prayer during the day was the alarm clock at night. The same sound that said here is the hour of God also said here is the hour of your obligation. Honour it or explain yourself. The church bell as alarm clock spread far beyond the monasteries. As towns grew around abbeys and priories, the bell that woke the monks woke the town. The bell that called the community to prayer also called the baker to light his oven, the merchant to open his shop, the smith to stoke his forge. The sound leaked out of the sacred and into the practical in the same gradual, invisible way that the water clock keeper's job had slipped from priestly to civic in Rome. By the time you had proper medieval towns with their guilds and their markets and their elaborate social structures, the church bell was functioning as the communal timekeeping system. It rang the canonical hours. It rang for fires. It rang for deaths. It rang for councils and markets and curfews. It was the voice of time itself, the sound that told you where you were in the day, and someone had to ring it. Someone who knew when to ring it. Someone who could read the water clock or the sundial and translate that reading into the physical act of pulling a rope. Someone, in other words, who was already awake so that everyone else could know when to wake up. You are that someone. The sacristan's job, translated through 8 centuries, stripped of its sacred context, and placed in the hands of a 19-year-old boy from Cheshire with a bamboo pole. The thought strikes you as funny in the dark on Pollard Street. The idea that you are a monk. The idea that Mrs. Hadfield is an abbess running a peculiarly secular version of a monastic community, tracking the hours in her ledger the way a sacristan tracked them in a psalter. You smile at this and almost immediately feel guilty about it, because smiling for no apparent reason at 4 a.m. in an empty street is the kind of thing that gets you looked at. Number 24 is where you stop smiling. Number 24 is Mary Dooley, widow, weaver, 4 children under the age of 10. Works the early shift at Murray's Mill. 4:20 a.m., 3p a week, and Mrs. Hadfield's note says, "Wake reliably, very light sleeper, important customer, don't miss." You tap the window. You wait. The street is silent around you. The church bell has not struck the quarter hour yet. Somewhere several streets away a dog barks twice and stops. A horse shifts its weight in a stable you can't see. The wind has dropped in the last few minutes and the cold has gotten heavier, settled. The kind of cold that comes when the air stops moving and just sits on you like a weight. No light in the window. You tap again. The wire spiral making its specific sound against the glass. Scratching. Insistent. Not quite loud enough to wake the neighbours if the neighbours are sleeping normally. Loud enough to wake a light sleeper. Loud enough to wake Mary Dooley, who is, according to Mrs. Hadfield's notes, a very light sleeper. Always awake on the first tap. Always. Nothing. You count to 30 in your head. 1, 2, 3, all the way to 30, letting the silence have its chance. Sometimes a person wakes on the first tap but needs 30 seconds to get themselves upright and to the window. Sometimes the candle takes a moment to light. Sometimes 30. Nothing. You do the third tap harder, the pole coming down with enough force that the wire end makes a sound against the glass that you know is audible from the street and probably from the houses on either side, and you're aware that you are crossing a line here. You're moving from professional subtlety into something more urgent, but the urgency is warranted because Mary Dooley is never not awake on the first tap, and Mary Dooley has 4 children and no husband and 3p a week for your services, which is the maximum rate on Mrs. Hadfield's scale, which means Mary Dooley understood from the start that reliable waking was worth paying for, which means something is wrong. A light, finally, moving in the wrong room. The kitchen, not the bedroom, which makes no sense because no one is in the kitchen at this hour. The light moves toward the window. A face appears. Not Mary Dooley's face. Her daughter. The oldest one, who you know is 8 years old because Mary Dooley mentioned it once. Through the window, the morning after the child's birthday. Mentioned it with the specific pride of a parent who can see the person their child is becoming and is almost frightened by it. The daughter. Standing at the window at 4:20 in the morning, holding a candle that is almost too big for her hands, looking down at you with an expression that is trying very hard to be calm. She opens the window an inch. The cold floods in toward her. She doesn't flinch. "Mum's poorly," she says. Her voice is very quiet and very steady, and it belongs to someone twice her age. She can't get up. You stand there for a moment with your pole under your arm. Is she hurt? Has someone fetched a doctor? She's burning up. Since yesterday she won't wake proper. Burning up. A fever. Not injured, not dead, just a fever. And you breathe out slowly because for the 30 seconds between the third tap and the face appearing at the window, you were running through a series of possibilities that included some very dark outcomes and a fever, while serious, while genuinely dangerous in 1882 is not the darkest of them. Has your neighbour been told? Mrs. What's her name next door? Mrs. Flynn. Yes, she came in last night. Is she there now? No, she went home when Mum fell asleep. We thought she'd wake for the morning. You think. Fast. Because there are 23 more clients on your list and they need waking. But there are also 4 children in this house with an unconscious mother, and the oldest one is 8 years old, and it is 4:20 in the morning, and the cold coming through that inch of open window is enough to make your fingers ache. Close the window, you say. Keep Mum warm. I'll fetch Mrs. Flynn. The child closes the window. You lean your pole against the wall of the house and walk 3 steps to the left to number 23, which is Mrs. Flynn, and you knock on the door, not the window. You knock on the door at 4:20 in the morning, which is not in your job description in any way at all. Mrs. Flynn, to her credit, is awake in under a minute. A large woman in a flannel nightgown and a shawl that she's pulled over her shoulders with the speed of someone who was already half expecting to be disturbed. She opens the door, looks at you, looks at your pole leaning against the wall of number 24 and understands. "Mary," she says. Not a question. Her daughter says she won't wake properly. Fever. Mrs. Flynn nods. She already has her shoes in her hand, pulling them on in the doorway with the practiced efficiency of a woman who has dealt with other people's crises many times before. "I'll sit with her till the shift change. Dr. Mains comes round on Thursdays if it's not better before then." You want to say something more. You're not sure what. You want to say something that acknowledges the weight of what you've just handed this woman, the weight of sitting with a sick neighbour and her 4 children while the city wakes up and goes to work around you. But you can tell from the set of Mrs. Flynn's jaw that she doesn't need you to say anything. She is already in the mode of doing what needs to be done, and your commentary is not helpful. "Thank you," you say. She waves her hand, goes inside. You retrieve your pole, make the mark in your head that means follow up on Mary Dooley, tell Mrs. Hadfield, and you walk on. Number 25, number 26. You are aware, in the minutes after Mary Dooley's window, of a particular texture of feeling that you can't quite name. Not grief, not fear. Something more like the sensation of being reminded of a truth you already knew but had been successfully ignoring. The truth that these 47 windows are not administrative units. They are not entries in a ledger. They are families. They are people whose lives go on after you walk away, whose fevers and worries and 8-year-old daughters holding candles in the cold are real and present and happening regardless of whether they are on your schedule. You've been doing this job for 6 months, and for the first 3 months you held it at arm's length. You treated it as a mechanical task, which is how you survived it. Go to this window, tap this many times, make this mark, move to the next one. The alternative was to be present to every story behind every window, and you were 19 years old and 3 months into a new city, and you couldn't afford to be present to everyone's story because it would have taken you apart at the seams. So you held it at arm's length and you did the task, and you went home at 6 in the morning and slept until 2 in the afternoon with the sounds of the city coming through the walls, and you ate whatever Mrs. Hadfield had left in the kitchen, and you were back on the street by 3 and starting again. But somewhere around month 4, the arm's length stopped working. You started noticing things you'd been successfully not noticing. The particular sound of Thomas Ridley's floor as he crossed it every morning. The creak always in the same place, the same sequence, reliable as a metronome. The way Martha Booth always, without exception, pulled back her curtain before she came to the window, even at 4:30 in the morning, because she didn't want to be seen before she was ready to be seen, and that small gesture of privacy in a life that had almost no privacy struck you as something to honour rather than note and move on from. You started remembering them, not just as entries in the ledger, but as people. And once you started remembering them as people, Mary Dooley's fever felt personal in a way that a ledger entry getting sick doesn't. You're still deciding whether this is the better way to be. Mrs. Hadfield, you think, would say no. She'd say you can't afford to feel it, or you'll burn out in a year, the same as the nurses at the infirmary who see too much and care too much and end up caring about nothing at all. She'd say the professional distance is what makes the job possible to do, night after night, week after week, year after year. She's been doing this for 28 years. She knows. But Mrs. Hadfield, you also know, sometimes stays in the kitchen long after her tea is cold, looking at nothing. And when you ask her if she's all right, she says she's just thinking. And you don't push it, but you wonder sometimes what she's thinking about. You wonder if it's the job, if it's the accumulated weight of 28 years of 47 windows per night, 28 years of being the person who stands between these people and their lateness, their docking, their dismissal, their hunger. If she carries all of that, if professional distance means you don't feel it in the moment but you feel it somewhere later, stored up, settled in some part of you that doesn't show, you don't know. You hope she'd tell you if it got too heavy. Number 27, number 28, number 29. The quarter-hour bell strikes 4:15. You're ahead of schedule now, which is the best feeling this job offers. The particular satisfaction of being ahead of time in a job that is entirely about time. Number 29. A young man named Danny Heap who runs cotton from the mill floor to the baling room and back again all day, which sounds simple until you understand that he covers roughly 12 miles on his feet during a single shift, is awake before your pole reaches vertical. He throws open the window and announces quietly but with conviction that today is the day he's going to ask for a raise, and you say good luck, and he says he doesn't need luck because he's calculated how much he's saving the mill in external cartage costs by doing the internal work himself. And if Mr. Hargreaves won't recognise that, then Mr. Hargreaves can find himself another boy. You want to tell him this is very probably not how negotiations with mill owners work, but you don't. He looks happy. He needs to be happy at 4:15 in the morning. It'll carry him through the shift. Good luck, you say again, and walk on. There were alarm clocks in 1882. I want to be clear about that. There were mechanical alarm clocks in existence when you're standing on Pollard Street with your pole. The technology was not new. The first true mechanical alarm clock, meaning a clock with a built-in mechanism that would strike a bell or make a noise at a preset time, existed by the 15th century, possibly earlier. The credit for its invention is disputed between several European horological traditions, the way all important inventions tend to have disputed credits. because genius is rarely as singular as the history books would like to make it, and multiple people in multiple places are usually coming up with the same ideas at roughly the same time because the same social pressures are acting on everyone and the same technological pieces are lying around waiting to be assembled. The monastery alarm clock story is compelling because it makes the link explicit. The monks needed to be woken for matins. Someone had to wake them. Eventually someone built a mechanism that would do it without human intervention. There are records from the 13th century of monastery clocks with alarm mechanisms, not elegant ones, not the kind of thing you'd display on a mantelpiece. Iron frames with toothed wheels and falling weights, and a peg on the hour wheel that, when it dropped into the right position, released a mechanism that rang a bell. Crude, unreliable, loud, but functional. The alarm clock in its essential form. The technology improved slowly over the next few centuries, the way all mechanical technology improved slowly before the Industrial Revolution, through guilds of craftsmen, through the accumulated knowledge of individual masters and their apprentices, through the patient refinement of mechanisms that were built by hand one at a time. By the 16th century, you had portable clocks small enough to carry, the ancestors of the pocket watch. By the 17th century, the pendulum clock, invented by Christian Huygens in 1656, had given you an accuracy that made everything before look approximate. A good pendulum clock would lose or gain less than a minute per day. That was revolution. That was a transformation so fundamental that it changed how people understood time, changed from something approximate and contextual to something precise and measurable, a thing that had objective standards rather than local interpretations. But here is the thing about mechanical clocks in the 18th and early 19th centuries. Here is the thing that explains why you're standing on this street at 4 a.m. with a bamboo pole, when mechanical alarm clocks technically exist. They were expensive, profoundly, prohibitively, grotesquely expensive for ordinary people. A good mechanical clock in 1800 cost more than a mill worker's monthly wages. A pocket watch cost more than a month's rent. These were objects that marked social status precisely because of their price, that sat in the parlours of the middling classes and on the waistcoats of merchants as signs of their position in the world. The idea that a spinner at Murray's Mill or a docker at Salford Quays might own a clock, let alone an alarm clock, was as absurd as the idea that they might own a carriage. Even into the 1860s and 1870s, as manufacturing methods improved and prices began to fall, alarm clocks remained luxury items. American manufacturers, particularly Seth Thomas and the New Haven Clock Company, began mass-producing affordable alarm clocks in the 1870s and 1880s, and the prices started to drop significantly. But significantly meant from impossible to merely difficult, from a month's wages to 2 or 3 weeks' wages, which was still more than most mill workers could contemplate as a purchase when they had rent and food and fuel to pay for first. And this is where you exist, historically speaking, in the gap, in the window of time between alarm clocks existing and alarm clocks being affordable for the people who need them most. The people who need an alarm clock more urgently than anyone else in the world are the people who must be at work at a precise time or face consequences. The people who must be at the factory gate when it opens or be docked a quarter day's pay. The people who can least afford that docking. The people who have the least financial buffer between a bad week and actual deprivation. And those are precisely the people who cannot afford a clock. So they hire you 2p a week, 3p a week. The specific arithmetic of Mrs. Hadfield's rate card, calibrated to what these workers can actually spend without tipping their household budget into crisis. 2 pence a week is less than the cost of being late once at Murray's Mill. 3 pence a week is considerably less than the cost of being dismissed. The economics of the knocker-up trade exist entirely in that gap. Cheaper than the consequence of not waking up. Cheaper than a clock. Valuable enough to be worth paying for every week out of a very tight budget. You think about this sometimes in the stretches of the round where you're not tapping windows, just walking between addresses, the pole balanced on your shoulder. The economics of being poor. The way poverty creates specific markets, specific trades, specific human adaptations. The knocker-up trade would not exist if everyone could afford a clock. The pawnshop trade would not exist if people had savings. The penny-a-night lodging house would not exist if people had homes they could be sure of keeping. Entire industries exist because people are poor, and the people in these industries, you included, are themselves generally not wealthy, and the whole thing creates a kind of closed ecosystem of mutual dependency at the bottom of the economic order, everyone keeping each other barely afloat. This is not a cheerful thought at 4:30 in the morning. You have 7 more clients in the next 20 minutes, and then a quarter-hour walk to the other side of Ancoats for the 11 after that. So you move faster now, your boots finding the rhythm on the cobblestones that comes from 6 months of repetition. The same streets, the same distances, the same sequence. So well learned that your body could do it without your brain's involvement, and sometimes nearly does. On the cold nights when the monotony of it gets into you, and you find yourself at number 34 having no memory of covering 30 through 33. Number 30, number 31. The streets are different here. Slightly newer houses, slightly better maintained, which doesn't mean much in absolute terms, but is visible if you've been walking past houses for 6 months and you've learned to read the microsignals of maintenance. The window frames that have been painted in the last year versus the ones that are down to bare wood. The doorsteps that get swept versus the ones that are perennial repositories for mud and soot. The houses where someone has grown something in a pot on the step. A scrawny geranium or a collection of herbs in a cracked jug. Small gestures toward beauty in circumstances that don't particularly support beauty. You've come to love these gestures. The geranium on the step tells you something essential about the person inside the house. They have not entirely given up on the idea of living rather than just existing. Number 31 has a geranium on the step, frost-blackened now, the November cold having done for it sometime in October, but still there, still in its pot, not yet given up on as a lost cause. The window lights up on the first tap. You're making good time. By the time the church bell strikes 4:45, you've reached number 37, which is the last one on this side of the district, and you turn south down a street you've walked so many times that you could draw it from memory, the precise spacing of the cobblestones, the exact position of the broken section of curb on the left-hand side that trips people who aren't paying attention, the alley halfway down that smells of something chemical and seems to smell more so in the cold. The city is starting to change. It's not awake yet, not properly, not by any measure that would register to a casual observer. The streets are still dark, the factories are still silent, but there's a quality to the air, a slight thickening of potential, the sense of a held breath before the release. You've felt this every morning for 6 months, and it still surprises you a little. The moment when night starts to become morning, and it's not any particular visual change, it's not light. There's no light yet, but something shifts. The birds feel it before anyone else. There are pigeons somewhere above you, shuffling on a ledge, making soft churring sounds that are not quite their daytime vocalizations, a transitional sound, the sound of a bird deciding whether it's time to be fully awake yet. It is not time yet, but it's coming. This is the moment, walking through the pre-dawn city with your pole, that you feel most clearly the thing that keeps you doing this job despite the cold and the early hours and the occasional Mary Dooley moment that puts a weight in your chest. The moment when the city is between states, when it's not night and not yet day, when it belongs to the people who are up at this hour, the knocker-uppers and the night soil men and the police constables on their beats, and the bakers who have already been at their ovens for 2 hours. There are not many of you, the people of the pre-dawn city. You know most of them by sight. You nod to the police constable, a man named Briggs, who has no relation to you but shares your surname, as you pass him on the corner of every street, at roughly the same point in your respective rounds every morning. You exchange nothing verbal, just the nod of two people who are part of the same world that most people never see, the world that keeps the visible world running. Number 38, number 39. The night soil men are out. They have to be out at this hour by law, the law that says the emptying of privies and cesspits must happen during the hours when the streets are least occupied, so that the carts loaded with their cargo can move from one end of the city to the other with the minimum possible impact on people who have noses and opinions about what those noses encounter. You hear them before you see them. The scrape of the wooden boards they use to seal the cesspit openings, the heavy thud of material dropping into the cart, the occasional brief exchange between the men who do this work, in voices that are conspicuously cheerful given what they're doing, the deliberate cheerfulness of people who have decided that if you're going to do a job that everyone else finds unmentionable, you might as well do it with a certain panache. You've talked to the night soil men. Not long conversations, the timing of your respective jobs doesn't allow for long conversations, but brief exchanges. The nod between the pre-dawn professionals that occasionally extends to a sentence or two. They are, without exception, matter-of-fact about their work in a way that you find bracing. No embarrassment, no apology. Just the professional orientation of people who have calculated that someone has to do it and they're the ones who've done it, and that calculation, once made and accepted, removes the social awkwardness that the work would otherwise carry. There's a metaphor in that. You're sure there's a metaphor in that. About the things that have to be done in order for the visible world to function, and the people who do them, and the relationship between visibility and value. But it's 4:45 in the morning and you're not in the condition for metaphors, so you just nod at the nearest night soil man, who nods back, and you carry on. Number 40. Number 41. These are the last ones before the long stretch. The next 6 clients are spread across 2 streets that form the southern boundary of your round, and between them and numbers 42 through 47, there's a walk of nearly a quarter mile that you make every night in whatever conditions the weather has decided to provide. Tonight, cold, dry, wind dropping now to almost nothing, which is better than last week when it was raining horizontally and the cobblestones were filmed with a thin sheen of water that made every step a considered exercise in not falling over with a 14-foot pole in your hands. The worst was February. You want to talk about the worst, because the worst is where the job reveals itself most fully, where the difference between what you're doing and a simple mechanical function becomes clear. February of this year was the coldest month on record for Manchester since 1814. The temperature dropped to -12 Celsius in the small hours of the 14th, which is the kind of cold that announces itself with a specific sound. The groan of cast iron as it contracts, the sharp crack of water freezing in pipes inside walls, The way your breath doesn't just mist but freezes slightly on your scarf, the hairs inside your nostrils going stiff with each breath. The gas lamps dimmed because the gas pressure dropped as the fuel struggled to move through pipes it was barely thin enough to fit through. The cobblestones became ice, not slippery ice, skating pond ice, but rough ice. Cobblestones each individually glazed, the mortar between them frozen and raised, creating a surface that was less walking surface and more obstacle course. You wore every piece of clothing you owned, layered, and you wore your boots with 2 pairs of socks, and you walked the round in under 3 hours because you didn't stop moving. Not for a second, because the moment you stopped moving, you could feel the cold catching up to you, settling in, looking for the gaps in your coat. You were thinking about the historical knockers-up in February, because cold is where the historical parallels get vivid. The sacristan in the medieval monastery, getting out of his cold bed in a cold cell to ring the cold bell for matins. The Roman water clock keeper, maintaining the flow of water through a vessel that would freeze solid in a Roman winter if not tended. The Egyptian temple priest, working with water in the desert cold of a winter night on the Nile, which could drop below freezing in ways that Europeans who think of Egypt as uniformly hot tend not to anticipate. Cold is what makes the mechanical solutions appealing. Cold is what gives the clockmaker his market. Every winter night you spent on that round, every February morning you came home with your fingers barely functional and had to sit by the stove for 20 minutes before you could hold a cup, added a small increment of understanding to why people would pay for a clock if they could afford one, why they would choose a mechanism over a person, not because the mechanism is better at the emotional work, not because the mechanism knows Mary Dooley's fever or Danny Heap's plan to ask for a raise, but because the mechanism doesn't suffer from the cold, doesn't need to be paid 3 pence a week, doesn't need feeding, doesn't lie awake afterward thinking about the weight of 47 families. The clockmakers' shops on Oldham Street had alarm clocks in the window. You'd seen them. You'd stopped and looked through the glass on 2 separate occasions, examining the mechanism, the coiled spring and the toothed wheel and the small hammer poised above the bell. Not large bells, not chapel bells, small bells, the kind you could muffle with a pillow if you needed to sleep longer, or couldn't muffle at all if you needed to be reliably woken. They had little price tickets attached with string. 2 shillings and 6pence for the American ones, the New Haven type, with their painted metal cases and the bell mounted on top like a crown. 4 shillings and 6pence for the English ones, heavier, more elaborate, with brass cases and a small key for winding. 2 shillings and 6pence was approximately a week and a quarter of your salary. 4 shillings and 6pence was nearly 2.5 weeks. But it was coming down. Mrs. Hadfield knew it, and talked about it sometimes in the way that someone discusses a weather system they can see forming on the horizon, with complete equanimity and no illusions about whether it will arrive. The prices were coming down, she said, because the American factories were making them faster and cheaper every year, and when the price came down far enough, her clients would buy clocks. Some of them would buy clocks even before then, because there was a point at which the calculation changed. Even if a clock cost as much as 6 weeks of paying for a knocker-up, a clock was a one-time purchase, where a knocker-up was a recurring expense. The arithmetic of it was visible from a certain angle. She said, "We've got 5 years, maybe 10. And when she said it, she didn't look distressed. She looked like someone who has made peace with the nature of their work in the world, who understands that their role is temporary because all roles are temporary, and the only reasonable response to that is to do the work well, while the work exists to be done. You admired her for this. You weren't sure you'd feel the same way in 28 years, watching your livelihood being replaced by a spring and a wheel and a small brass hammer, but you admired her for it. Number 42, number 43. These are the hardest ones, the last group. Not because the clients are difficult, they're mostly easy. The ones at this end of the round are older workers, experienced, people who've been getting themselves up before dawn for 20 years and have the skill of it, who wake on the first tap and don't need a second. But they're the hardest, because by this point in the round your body knows you're nearly done. And when your body knows you're nearly done, it starts releasing the tension. It's been holding for the last 2 hours, and when the tension releases, you feel the cold more sharply. Feel the tired feet more sharply. Feel the weight of the pole more sharply. Feel every decision and every observation of the last 2.5 hours settling into you like the cold does, filling the gaps. You're thinking about Mary Dooley, about the child's face at the window holding the candle, about Mrs. Flynn going back in without complaint with her shawl and her shoes. You're thinking about Thomas Ridley's 3 fingers at the window and John Hennessy's slow nod of acknowledgement and Danny Heap's plan to ask for a raise that probably won't go the way he thinks it will. You're thinking about Arthur Capper at the gasworks, awake before you arrived, his body clock reset by 22 years of night shifts so that 2:30 in the morning is his dawn. You're thinking about what it would feel like to have that happen to you, to have your internal rhythms so thoroughly rewritten by the demands of your work that the ordinary structure of day and night no longer applied to you, whether that would feel like freedom or like something had been taken from you. The question of what time does to the human body and what the human body does to time is one you've been turning over since you started this job without having quite the vocabulary for it. The vocabulary will come later, in the next century, in the field of chronobiology, which will document in elegant technical detail everything you've been experiencing empirically at the end of a bamboo pole, the suprachiasmatic nucleus and its light-dependent calibration, the circadian rhythms of cortisol and melatonin, the phenomenon of social jet lag, the mismatch between your body's natural clock and the clock the world imposes on you, which researchers will eventually document as a significant contributor to health problems in night workers and early shift workers and anyone else whose schedule diverges substantially from what the sun would suggest. All of that will be discovered, documented, published, presented at conferences. In 1882, what you have is observation. The 47 windows of evidence that you've been accumulating for 6 months, the specific expressions of bodies at different points in their sleep cycles, being interrupted in the middle of the night by a wire spiral on a bamboo pole. Thomas Ridley, who is genuinely difficult to wake and arrives at the window every morning looking like a man who's been retrieved from somewhere very deep. Martha Booth, who is waiting for you, who may barely sleep at all. Grace Marsden, who seems to be getting worse, whose candle comes more slowly each week, whose face at the window has acquired a quality of exhaustion that is different from the exhaustion of not enough sleep, more like the exhaustion of having no rest even when you're sleeping. These observations are not in Mrs. Hadfield's ledger. They're in you, the human part of the job that the mechanical alarm clock cannot do. This is worth saying clearly, I think, before we get any further into the night. The alarm clock, when it finally becomes affordable and universal, which it will, which is only about 15 years away from this moment on Pollard Street, will solve the logistical problem of waking at a specific time. It will solve it brilliantly. It will render the knocker-up trade obsolete with the particular ruthlessness of technological progress, which doesn't care about the human ecosystem it displaces, only about the efficiency of the replacement. And in most respects it will be better, more reliable, less expensive, available at any hour, not dependent on a person being able to walk through the cold and reach your window with a 14-foot pole. But the alarm clock will not know that Grace Marsden is getting worse. The alarm clock will not notice that Martha Booth may not be sleeping at all. The alarm clock will not look at the child's face at the window and understand what it means that the child is there instead of the mother. The alarm clock will ring and then wait, mechanically, for someone to stop it. Whether that person is all right, whether they came to the clock or the clock waited forever for someone who was lying in the other room with a fever, whether the household behind the window is functioning or in crisis, none of this is in the alarm clock's purview. It rings. That's all it does. You do more than ring. Number 44, number 45, 2 to go. The sky to the east, the direction of the Pennines, is not yet light, but has achieved a quality of darkness that is subtly different from the darkness at midnight. Not lighter, exactly. Richer somehow. More potential in it. The darkness before dawn has a texture to it that the darkness of midnight does not. A held-in quality, the way you feel the moment before you exhale. If you were to describe it to someone who had never noticed it, you'd say, it's the same dark, but it means something different. You've become very good at reading darkness. This is not a skill most people develop, because most people are asleep during the hours when darkness has its full range of meaning. You know the dark of midnight, which is the dark of the city fully committed to not being observed. The dark where the only people out are the people who are up to something, or the people whose jobs require them to be up to something, and the quality of it is absolute, total, a dark that has settled in for the duration. You know the dark of 2 a.m, which has started to hollow out slightly, has lost some of its commitment, the way a crowd starts to thin as the evening gets late, not gone yet, but going. You know the dark of 3, which is the dark of the deepest point, the coldest, the quietest, the point at which the human body most wants to be horizontal and unresponsive. You know the dark of 4, which is where you are now, where you've been for the last 40 minutes, and it's the dark that is starting to reconsider. And you know the dark of 5, which is where you'll be by the time you finish number 47. And that dark is a specific and wonderful thing because it's the last dark. The dark that is barely hanging on. The dark that is losing ground to a light that hasn't fully arrived yet but has made its intentions known. The birds know it first. The pigeons stir. The sparrows, if there are any sparrows at this latitude in November, which there are not many of, make sharp, declarative sounds in the gaps between buildings. The horses in the stables shift and breathe, and then, over the rooftops to the east, the sky goes from black to dark blue, and the dark blue goes to a grey that has warmth in it, and the first outlines of chimney stacks become visible against that grey, and the city starts to be a shape rather than just a darkness. That is the moment. That's what you get for the cold and the early hours and the accumulated weight of 47 stories. That moment when the city becomes visible again. Number 46, Ethan Moore. Stoker at the boiler house of number 2 Mill. He has to be in by 5 o'clock and he has to be there early, because the boiler takes time to bring up to pressure. And if the boiler isn't up to pressure when the shift starts, the entire mill stops. And if the entire mill stops, that's 1,000 workers idle. And Mr. Hargreaves in a state that the polite language of 1882 describes as very much displeased. Ethan Moore understands this. He wakes on the first tap every single morning with the speed of someone who has thoroughly internalized the consequences of not waking on the first tap. Number 46 lights up. You move on. Number 47, the last one. Alice Park, spinner. She works the standard shift, 5:30 to 6 at night, and her wake time is 4:50, which is later than most on your list, and her 3p per week rate reflects a negotiation she had with Mrs. Hadfield that you weren't present for, but that Mrs. Hadfield described afterward with something approaching respect. Alice Park came to discuss her account, Mrs. Hadfield said, and she had done the arithmetic. She had calculated the cost of being woken 5 days a week versus the cost of being docked, pay for being late, and she had proposed a rate that accounted for the fact that her shift start was later than most, and therefore the urgency was slightly lower. She had proposed this with a written note, which she had put through the letterbox because she was too embarrassed to say it in person. Mrs. Hadfield had read the note, considered it, and written a note back agreeing to the rate because she told you the woman had done the arithmetic correctly, and that deserved to be rewarded. Alice Park's window, 4:50, your last tap of the night. The wire spiral hits the glass and makes its sound, and the sound bounces off the brick face of the terrace across the street and comes back to you faintly, a tiny echo of itself, like a reminder that it happened, that this moment existed, that somewhere behind this glass a woman is being pulled from sleep into the world. The light appears, you lower the pole, stand back. Look up at the rectangle of candlelight that is Alice Park's window. She doesn't come to the glass. She doesn't need to. The light is enough. The light means, I'm awake. I acknowledge the obligation. I will be at the mill at 5:30. You can go home now. You turn away from number 47's window and begin the walk back. There are mechanics to this walk that feel different from the mechanics of the round itself. Going out, you're moving through a list, checking things off, your mind running slightly ahead of your feet, thinking about the next address, the next client, the timing. Coming back, there's no list, just the streets, and the growing light, and the sound of a city in the very first stages of coming awake. A clockmaker in London, a man named Thomas Mudge, invented the lever escapement in 1757, which is the mechanism at the heart of almost every mechanical clock made since. Before the lever escapement, clock mechanisms were complicated and fragile and had to be adjusted regularly by skilled hands. After it, the relationship between the coiled spring or falling weight and the toothed wheel that it powered became precisely, reliably controlled in a way it hadn't been before. The lever escapement made mechanical timekeeping accurate to within seconds per day rather than minutes. It made the pocket watch possible as a genuinely useful tool rather than a fashionable approximation, and it made the eventual mass production of alarm clocks inevitable, because the mechanism was reliable enough to scale, to be reproduced in a factory rather than made by a craftsman one at a time. Thomas Mudge died in relative obscurity. The watchmakers of London eventually recognised his contribution with a gift of £500 from Parliament, which he received in his last years, and which is the kind of belated recognition that history specialises in. Too late to matter much to the person it's meant to honour, just in time to give everyone else the comfort of having acknowledged the debt. The lever escapement changed the world more thoroughly than most inventions whose names everyone knows. It changed what time meant. It changed who owned time. It started the chain of events that ends in your eventual obsolescence as a knocker-up. that ends in Mrs. Hadfield closing her ledger for the last time, and the bamboo poles hanging unused on the back of a workshop door somewhere, gathering dust. But it also started the chain of events that created this city, this industry, this network of mills and factories and workers and schedules that makes the knocker-up trade not just possible but necessary. The Industrial Revolution that built Manchester's mills ran on clock time, on the reduction of human activity to standardized units that could be measured and compared and compensated, on the shift from the agricultural time of seasons and sunlight to the industrial time of hours and quarters, and the precisely specified moment when the factory gate opens. The clock didn't just measure the Industrial Revolution, it made it possible. And the first clock that mattered for most ordinary people wasn't the one in their pocket or on their mantelpiece. It was the mill clock, the one mounted high on the factory wall where everyone could see it, whose time was the law, whose hands determined whether you were paid or docked, whether you kept your job or lost it, whether your children ate or went hungry. The mill clock was the argument for punctuality translated into iron and glass and Roman numerals, and the knocker-up was the system that stood between the worker and the mill clock's verdict. You reach the corner of Ancoats Lane. The sky above the rooftops is definitely grey now, the grey that has warmth in it, the grey of 7 minutes before the sun comes up. There's light on the chimneys of the mills, the upper portions just barely lit, turning from black to dark brick to something close to their actual colour. A horse and cart passes you heading toward the market, the horse's breath steaming, the driver huddled on the seat with his shoulders up around his ears, looking like a man who has accepted the reality of his situation without particularly enjoying it. The factories will be opening in less than half an hour. Thomas Ridley's shift, Martha Booth's shift, Danny Heap's shift with his plan to ask for a raise. 37 of your 47 clients filing through factory gates before 6 o'clock, joining the 1,000 or more from other streets, from other rounds that other knocker-ups have walked. The whole system of pre-dawn human effort converging on the mill buildings with their dark brick and their enormous windows and their clocks. You are the mechanism that made all of that possible. You are the thing between the sleeping body and the working day, and now that thing is done, and you can go home. Mrs. Hadfield's house is in a court off Great Ancoats Street, which is 15 minutes from the end of your round on a normal walking day, and 12 on a cold morning when you want to get there quickly. You walk the 12-minute version. The house is one of the older ones in this part of the city, a bit bigger than the terraced houses on your round, with a ground floor where Mrs. Hadfield keeps the office, which is to say a table with the ledger on it, and a fire that she lights before she starts her own rounds and which is still going when you get back, banked down to embers that put out a steady warmth. There's a kettle on the hob that she fills at night, and which by this time in the morning is not boiling but is warm enough to be useful. You let yourself in with your key. The kitchen is dark except for the red glow from the banked fire. You set the pole in the rack by the door, the rack that Mrs. Hadfield's husband built before he died, sized for the poles, with a hook for the tin rattle and a shelf for the spare wire coils, and the small tin of oil you use to keep the wire from rusting. You take off your coat and your gloves and your hat, hanging them on the peg by the door. Your fingers take a while to start working properly. They always do. You flex them over the warmth from the hob, feeling the sensation come back in stages. The pins and needles stage, then the aching stage, then the stage where they're just cold rather than numb, and you can make a fist and feel all 4 fingers and the thumb respond. You make tea. This is also a ritual. The making of tea at the end of the round. standing at the kitchen table with the warmth of the fire behind you, and the kettle in your hands, and the light coming through the kitchen window, going from grey to pale gold as the sun finally gets itself organised. You drink the tea standing up because you're too tired to sit down properly, or rather because sitting down properly feels like a commitment you're not ready to make yet, a commitment to stopping, and while you're standing you're still technically in between the round and sleep, still in a state of productive possibility, not yet surrendered. Mrs. Hadfield's notes from the previous night are on the table, her cramped writing in the ledger laid open to the Pollard Street page. She's added 2 notes since you left. One about a new client in the upper streets who needs adding to the rounds from Monday next, and one about a complaint from a neighbour of number 31 about noise in the small hours of the morning, which is the complaint she was hoping to avoid when you were tapping number 22 extra hard. You'll deal with that later, or Mrs. Hadfield will deal with it, which is more likely because she has a particular skill for managing complaint, a skill that involves listening with total attention while communicating absolutely zero concession, which is a combination you haven't managed to acquire yet, and may not for years. You finish the tea upstairs. The room you sleep in is at the back of the house, which means it faces north and never gets direct light, which means it's dark enough to sleep in during the daytime hours when you need to sleep, which is one of the practical considerations Mrs. Hadfield cited when she offered you the room. She understood from 28 years of doing this work herself that sleeping in the daytime is not the same as sleeping at night, that the light comes through anyway, that the city is noisier during the day than at night, in ways that interrupt sleep unless you have a room that minimizes both. The north-facing room with the heavy curtain is her solution to this problem, and it works better than you'd have expected. The bed is cold. It's always cold when you get into it because the fire in your room gets lit only in the evening, when you're getting ready to go out, not in the morning when you're getting in. You've learned to get into the bed quickly and pull the blankets up all at once and stay very still while your body heat warms the space around you, and this takes about 3 minutes, and those 3 minutes are the most uncomfortable part of the whole process. You lie still, blankets up to your chin, eyes on the ceiling, which in the grey morning light is just visible, the plaster with its small crack running from the window to the chimney breast, which has been there since before you arrived and will be there after you leave, and which you've spent enough time looking at that you've begun to see it as a kind of companion. Your feet begin to warm, then your legs, then your hands pressed flat under the blanket against your stomach. The city sounds come through the window, not the sounds you walked through, the intimate sounds of empty streets and solitary footsteps and the wire on glass. These are the sounds of the city waking up in earnest. The first mill horn, distant, not your mills, a mill further toward town, 5:30 exactly. The horn carrying in the morning air as clear as the church bell, then another horn, closer, then the sound of a cart, then voices, then the complex, layered audio landscape of a city that has made the decision to begin its day, doors opening, boots on cobblestones, the accumulated noise of 500,000 lives getting moving. You lie in it and let it happen around you and think about Mary Dooley's daughter with the candle. You think about the sacristan in the monastery, waking before dawn to ring the bell. You think about the Egyptian temple priest with his stone bowl, watching the water level drop, reading time from the movement of something as simple as water through a hole. You think about Thomas Mudge and his lever escapement, and the way that one mechanism, developed by one man in a workshop in London in 1757, was going to end up replacing you and Mrs. Hadfield and every other person who had ever made their living by being awake so that other people could sleep. You think about what it means to be the thing that stands between people and their obligation to time, not the clock, not the mechanism, the human thing, the thing that can look at a face behind glass and know, from the quality of the way the candle holds, that something is wrong. That's not nothing. That's not a function you can replace with a spring and a hammer on a bell. But it's also temporary. Everything useful that can be replaced by a mechanism eventually is, because mechanisms don't get cold and don't have complicated feelings about Mary Dooley and don't need paying. You've made peace with this, or you're making peace with it. The difference between those two states is not always clear from the inside. Your body is warm now, all of it, the whole length of you from toes to shoulders, and the warmth is doing what warmth always does to an exhausted body at this hour, which is pressing you down, pulling you under, dissolving the edges of your thoughts into something softer and less defined. The mill horn sounds a second time. The city is fully committed to its day. You're not committed to anything except sleep. You think of Arthur Capper at the gasworks, already 2 hours into his night shift, stoking the furnaces that feed the gas that lights the lamps that you walked under all night. The infrastructure of light, maintained by a man whose body thinks 2:30 is morning. Arthur Capper keeping the city's lights on while the city sleeps, and you waking the city up, and the city going to work making the things that keep it alive, and every part of this system dependent on every other part, the whole thing a kind of clockwork in itself. Human clockwork, flesh and bone and schedule and the wire spiral on the glass. The clock on the mantelpiece in the kitchen below, the one Mrs. Hadfield winds every evening before she goes out, strikes 6:30. The sound comes up through the floorboards faintly. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6.5, the half-hour chime. Outside, the city continues. Inside, you're falling. Not fast, not all at once. Sleep, when it comes after a night's work, comes in layers. The way the city itself is layered, the way the smells are layered, each one something distinct underneath the previous one. The top layer is thought, still moving, still turning over the morning's observations, still running the list of 47 names, still seeing Mary Dooley's daughter at the window. Then below that, the thinking gets vaguer, less sequential, and the names start to come disconnected from their odd texts. Thomas Ridley separate from his three-fingered window gesture, Grace Marsden's candle unattached from Grace Marsden's face. Just light, just a small moving light in a dark window. Then below that, nothing. The good nothing. The dark nothing. The nothing that is the body finally insisting on its own terms, saying, enough. Enough thinking, enough watching, enough walking, enough standing in the cold, enough being the mechanism between the sleeping world and the waking one. Here is where you put that down. Here is where you're not the knocker-up, not the heir of the sacristan and the water clock keeper and the temple priest with his stone bowl. Here is where you're just a body in a bed in a north-facing room with a cracked ceiling, and the city can manage its own waking for the next 8 hours. It can't, of course. It can't manage without someone doing what you do. It won't have to, not for much longer, because the American clockmakers are working on it, are improving the spring mechanism and reducing the cost. And in 15 years or 20 years, the 2 and 6 penny alarm clock will be 1 shilling and 6pence. And in 30 years, it will be less than 1 shilling. And the knocker-up trade will die the way all trades die when they are replaced. Gradually, and then all at once. But that's later. Right now, in this moment, the 47 windows of Ancoats are lit by the morning. The mill horns have sounded. Thomas Ridley is at his post. Martha Booth is at her spindles. Danny Heap is walking his 12 miles of cotton, and Grace Marsden, who was at her window later than she should have been, is at her loom. Arthur Capper is banking down the night's furnaces. Alice Park is tying on her apron, and Mary Dooley is in her bed with her fever, and her daughter is at school, or not at school, and Mrs. Flynn is or isn't still next door, and the world of that house is doing what it needs to do without your involvement now. You've given them all the morning. That's what the job is. You give them the morning. You stand in the dark and you tap the glass and you give them the morning one window at a time. And what they do with it is theirs. You are not responsible for their shift or their wages or their family or their fever or their plan to ask for a raise that probably won't go the way they hope. You are responsible for the tap on the glass, the wire on the window, the signal that says, time exists and you are part of it. Wake up. The day is coming. You gave it to them. And now you are done with giving it. And it is yours, this time, these hours, this north-facing room and its cracked ceiling and its heavy curtain, and the warmth pooling around you under the blankets. This is the thing you get in exchange for the cold and the dark and the 47 windows. This is the payment the job makes in the currency that actually matters. Sleep. The sound of the city is still there. It doesn't stop. Manchester doesn't stop. It never stops. The carts and the voices and the distant machinery and the mill horns and the pigeons and the wind and the whole dense, living, breathing noise of 500,000 people living in close proximity with each other. All of that is still there. But it's coming from outside, from the world on the other side of your window, the day world, the world that is awake and working and moving through its hours. You can hear it, but you are not in it. You are in the other place. The place between that world and wherever it is that sleep goes. The territory that has no name and no clock and no 47 names on a list. The mill horn sounds a third time, 7:15. The morning shift is fully engaged. You don't hear it. You've already gone. Think about sleep for a moment. Not as a problem to be managed or a luxury to be allocated. As a thing in itself. As the thing that almost all animal life requires, that evolution has preserved through 100 million years of pressure and selection, because the costs of not sleeping are worse than the costs of being unconscious for a third of your life. The thing that heals damaged tissue and consolidates memory and regulates emotion and allows the brain to do the processing it can't do while it's managing a body's interaction with the world. The thing that the Industrial Revolution in its early decades treated as a budget item to be minimized, that the factory owners of the 18th century tried to replace with stimulants and fear, that the mill workers died early from partly because they didn't get enough of it. Sleep was the radical proposition, the idea that a human body had rights over its own rest, that the time between shifts was not productivity withheld from the owner, but recovery that the body was entitled to. This idea sounds obvious from where you're standing in history, assuming you're standing in a part of the world that has labour protections and 8-hour workdays and the concept of a weekend. It was not obvious in 1882. It was a proposition that was being argued for, fought for, legislated for, inch by inch, in the long, slow process of the labour movement that began in factories like the ones your 47 clients work in. The 12-hour shift at Murray's Mill will eventually be 10 hours, then 8. Not in 1882, not yet, but the direction of travel is established. The beginning of the end of the factory's complete ownership of the workers' time is already in progress. And when that happens, when the working hours get shorter and the sleep time expands even slightly, and when the alarm clock becomes affordable, and when the knocker-up trade fades away, what will actually have changed? The need to wake at a specific time will not have changed. The terror of being late, of missing the morning, of the gap between sleeping body and obligation will not have changed. What will have changed is the mechanism. The human mechanism will have been replaced by a mechanical one, and the consequences will be cheaper, more reliable, less dependent on the cold and the dark and the 14-foot pole, and also less humane, less observant, less able to see the face of a child at a window and know that something is wrong. Whether that trade is a good one is a question that doesn't have a clean answer, and I suspect you already know that, wherever you are right now, lying in whatever century's version of a bed with whatever century's darkness outside your window. Because you have an alarm clock. Of course you do. Everyone does. Everyone has had one for so long that the alternative seems almost comical. A person with a pole standing outside your window at 4 a.m. tapping the glass. The notion is quaint, charming, the kind of thing that ends up in a heritage museum with an explanatory plaque. But the problem the knocker-up solved has not gone away. The problem is this. The human body, left to its own devices, does not want to wake at a fixed time. It wants to wake when it's ready, when the light and the temperature and its own internal clock agree that it's time. It wants to follow the slow rhythms it was built for, the circadian rhythms that evolved over hundreds of thousands of years, when the sun was the only clock and the seasons were the only deadline. It does not want to be interrupted, pulled from its cycles, forced into the arbitrary grid of hours that industrial civilization invented, and that has been growing finer and more precise and more demanding ever since. Every alarm clock in every bedroom is a tiny negotiation between that ancient body and the modern world. Every morning when the spring releases and the hammer hits the bell, or the phone on your bedside table makes whatever sound you've chosen for it, something in you resists. Something very old says, not yet. A few more minutes, the warmth, the dark. Let me go back, and you get up anyway, or you don't, or you hit the snooze button, which is the technological descendant of asking the knocker-up for 5 more minutes and putting your hand up with 5 fingers spread. The knocker-up is gone. The problem is the same. The negotiation continues. It's winter now, and the longest nights are coming. December will bring days when the sun barely gets above the rooftops before it starts to go down again, and you'll be doing your rounds in darkness that lasts from mid-afternoon to well past when you start at 2:30, and the cold will be the kind that the moors produce, the specific cold of high ground and distance, and your fingers will spend a lot of time in the almost numb stage. But December also brings the frost, and in a bad winter the frost brings something the city rarely gets to see. You saw it last year, on the 14th of January, when the temperature dropped hard enough fast enough that the canal froze solid overnight, not just at the edges but all the way across. 12 feet of water turned to ice, and in the morning, before the mills started and the traffic began and the first boats broke through, there was a moment when you walked past the canal on your way back from the rounds, and the ice was flat and white and completely undisturbed, and the sunrise was reflected in it. And the whole thing looked like something that had nothing to do with industrial Manchester, nothing to do with coal smoke and cotton and factory gates and 14-foot poles. It looked like a field. It looked like the fields outside the village in Cheshire where you grew up. The ones that froze in January and stayed frozen for weeks sometimes, where you used to slide in your boots as a child before anyone expected anything from you at 5 a.m. You stood there for maybe 2 minutes, which is a long time given how cold it was and how recently you'd finished the round, and how much the bed was pulling at you. But it felt important. It felt like the city was briefly doing something for you instead of the other way around, showing you something for free. Then a coal barge broke through from the western end, and the ice cracked across the entire surface in a sound like a sheet being torn, and the canal was a canal again, and you walked home. You think about that ice sometimes. On the cold mornings when the round feels mechanical, when the 47 windows are just 47 obligations rather than 47 people, when your hands are too cold and your feet are too cold, and the moon is behind clouds and the gas lamps are doing their pale flame thing, and there is nothing particularly wonderful about any of it. You think about the canal and the ice and the reflected sunrise and the 2 minutes of free time that the city gave you, and it's enough. It's a small enough piece of something that isn't obligation to carry you through the obligation of the rest. Mrs. Hadfield gave you a piece of advice in the 3rd month that you've been unpacking ever since. She said, "This job will give you something you don't expect, and you won't know what it is until it's given it to you, and it will be different from what it gives anyone else. And you can't rush it or manufacture it. You just have to keep showing up and doing the work until it arrives." You didn't know what she meant then. You thought you understood what the job was. Walk, tap, walk, tap. 47 windows, 3 hours, go home. The skill was in the timing and the technique and the management of 47 different relationships with sleep. But she meant something else, something harder to name, something about being the one awake when everyone else is sleeping, the one responsible for the hinge between night and morning, the one who carries the list of obligations so that the people on the list can set down the worry of whether they'll meet them. Something about the particular view you get of human life when you see it at its most unguarded, through a window at 4 a.m, face unprepared, consciousness still tangled in whatever it was dreaming. She meant, this job will show you people as they actually are. And that's a gift that most people never get. Because most people only ever see each other with their armour on. You're starting to understand. The light outside your window is fully morning now, though the curtain keeps it from being oppressive. A pale seam of yellow-grey light along the edge of the curtain, where it doesn't quite reach the frame. A reminder that the world is still there, still doing what it does, still being daytime. You can ignore it. You've learned to ignore it. Outside the city, inside, you. The list of 47 names dissolves. Mary Dooley and her daughter, Thomas Ridley and his 3 fingers, Arthur Capper at his window at 2:30, awake before you arrived. Danny Heap and his rays that won't go the way he hopes. Grace Marsden and her candle that comes more slowly each week. Martha Booth, who may not sleep at all. They dissolve. You've been awake for 23 hours if you count from when you got up yesterday afternoon. The average Victorian mill worker slept 5 to 7 hours out of every 24, which is about 2 hours less than the body optimally needs, and the cumulative sleep debt from that shortfall was one of the many slow ways the Industrial Revolution spent its workers. You sleep 7 hours most days, which means you are doing slightly better than the people you wake, which seems right, which seems like the job providing for itself in the way that jobs sometimes do if you let them. 7 hours. You'll be up at 2. The kettle will go on, the coat will go on, the pole will come off the rack, but that's later. Right now, nothing. Good nothing. The body making its claim. Something about this moment, this specific moment at the end of the round when the job is done and the clients are at their mills and you are horizontal in the dark with the sounds of the city coming through the walls. Something about it is the same as every human being who has ever lain down to sleep after doing something difficult. The Egyptian priest with his stone bowl, the medieval sacristan having rung his bell, the Roman water clock keeper who has announced the hours and can now close his eyes. All of them doing this same thing. All of them in the gap between obligation and renewal, in the space where you are no longer what the world needs you to be, and not yet what you'll be when you wake. Just a body. Just a sleeping body. With the warmth coming up from the blankets and the sounds fading and the ceiling disappearing into the soft dark behind your closed eyes, the geography of the room losing its edges, the window becoming abstract, the street below becoming theoretical, the 47 windows becoming a hum rather than a list, a frequency, something you can feel in your chest without naming. The morning belongs to them now. This belongs to you. Centuries from now, people will lie in rooms very much like this one, in cities very much like this one, and they will have alarm clocks of extraordinary sophistication, clocks that know their sleep cycles and time their alarms to the lightest moment of the lightest phase, clocks that analyze sleep and measure heartbeats and adjust their intervention to the biology of the body underneath the blanket. And those people will still, some mornings, lie in the warmth and resist the alarm, will still reach for the snooze, will still negotiate with the morning, because the body's argument against the clock is not a technological problem. It is a permanent condition of being human. It is the conversation between what we are built to do and what we have decided to do instead. You are not built to be awake at 3 a.m. This city is not built for the body. But the body adapts. The body always adapts. Arthur Capper's body adapted. Martha Booth's body adapted. Maybe too thoroughly. Maybe to a point where sleep is no longer available to her in the way it should be. Your body is adapting. 6 months of waking at 2 p.m. and starting work at 2:30 a.m. and finishing at 5:30 and being in bed by 7, and your body has begun to take this seriously, has begun to adjust its tides accordingly, the cortisol and the melatonin and the temperature cycling to fit the new schedule rather than the ancestral one. You are becoming Arthur Capper. In a small way, in a reversible way. But the machine of your biology is obedient in this particular respect, will calibrate itself to whatever schedule you impose on it, with enough consistency and enough patience, will reset its dawn and its dusk to match yours rather than the sun's. Whether this is a gift or a cost is one of those questions that doesn't have a clean answer in 1882, and doesn't have one in your century either. The city clock on the church tower strikes 7, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. You don't hear it. Or you hear it the way you hear things in the first layer of sleep, registering without interpreting, the sound passing through consciousness like a stone through still water, making a shape and then letting it close over again. 7 o'clock, 2 hours since you finished the round, 2 hours since you tapped number 47's window and turned away and began the walk home, 2 hours since the city started to come alive behind you as you walked. Mary Dooley's daughter got herself to school, maybe. Or maybe she stayed home to watch her mother. Mrs. Flynn is or isn't still next door. Thomas Ridley is at his frame. Martha Booth is at her spindles, her arms going in and out of the machinery with 32 years of practice and 2 missing fingers and absolutely no hesitation. 'Cause hesitation near that machinery is what costs you the fingers in the first place. Danny Heap is carrying cotton from one end of the mill floor to the other, 12 miles worth of carrying that he's already started doing, and maybe he's thinking about his raise, and maybe he's realised it's better to let the thought settle for a day or two before he takes it to Mr. Hargreaves, and Alice Park is at her spindle, and Ethan Moore's boilers are up to pressure, and Arthur Capper is finishing his night, bank the furnaces, sign out, walk home, go to bed at 7:30, the same as you. Two pre-dawn workers passing each other's windows in the early morning, both heading for the same good dark and the same deserved rest. The city is doing what cities do. You're doing what tired bodies do. The sound of the mill horn, very faint, very distant. The 5-minute warning horn before the second shift of the day begins. It's 7 in the morning. There are people just starting their day the way you're just starting your sleep. The horn is the last thing, or not quite the last thing. The last thing is the thought of the canal in January, the ice and the reflected sunrise and the 2 minutes of free time that appeared like a gap in the machinery, like a space between the obligations, like the city briefly remembering that it was not always a city, that it was once fields and river and moorland and the long, slow rhythms of things that don't run on clock time. The canal in January, the white ice, the sky in it. You carry that with you, down, all the way down. Good night. Wait. Not yet. There's more you need to know before the dark takes you fully. There's more that wants to be said about this particular night, about the particular history that brought you here, about the astonishing complexity of the thing you've just done so simply. Walked through a city in the dark and touched 47 sleeping people's mornings with a wire and a bamboo stick. Let me take you backward for a while, into the deep past of time itself, because the story of the knocker-up begins somewhere around 1500 years before the birth of Christ, in the administrative offices of the Egyptian New Kingdom, in a city we now call Luxor, which the Egyptians called Waset, the city of 100 gates, the city of Amun, the city that was for centuries the most important place in the most powerful civilization on earth. And the story begins not with a ceremony or a battle or a royal decree, but with the most mundane problem imaginable. Someone needed to be somewhere at a specific time, in the dark, and didn't know when that time had arrived. The Egyptians were extraordinarily concerned with time, not as an abstraction, but as a practical religious and administrative requirement. Their entire civilization ran on cycles. The flooding of the Nile, the agricultural calendar, the movements of celestial bodies that they tracked with obsessive precision, the festival calendar of the gods which required rituals to be performed at specific moments, or the relationship between the human and divine orders would break down. Anubis would not weigh your heart correctly at the wrong hour. Ra would not make his nightly journey through the underworld on the wrong schedule. The gods needed time to be kept the way any office needs its records kept, accurately, consistently, without interruption. So the Egyptians built instruments. The earliest were simple shadow sticks, a vertical post whose shadow you could read like a sundial, useful in the daytime, useless at night. Then came the Merkit, a device for tracking star positions that allowed you to measure the hours of darkness by watching which stars were at which position in the sky. A skilled observer with a Merkit could tell you the hour of the night to within perhaps 30 minutes, which was adequate for most purposes. Then came the clepsydra, the water clock, the stone bowl with the hole. The Egyptian water clocks were more sophisticated than the description makes them sound. They were not simply bowls with holes. The finest ones were carved from alabaster, a stone that the Egyptians chose specifically because it was translucent. You could see the water level from outside. You didn't have to look into the bowl. The hole at the base was carefully calibrated. Too large and the water drained too fast, the markings too compressed. Too small, and the water dripped so slowly that the markings had to be impractically large. The inner surface was marked with 12 divisions for each month of the year, accounting for the fact that summer nights are shorter than winter nights, that the 12 hours of darkness in summer are physically shorter than the 12 hours of darkness in winter. So the divisions for summer months are closer together than the divisions for winter months. This is the moment when humanity became precise about time, when the tool for measuring time became sophisticated enough to account for the variation in time itself, when the instrument acknowledged that the universe does not give us uniform units to work with, and we have to correct for that rather than pretend it isn't happening. The Egyptian water clock was doing something conceptually advanced. It was modelling the relationship between the measurement of time and the physical reality of time, and it was doing it in stone and water 4,000 years ago. The priests who maintained these instruments were among the most educated people in Egypt. They needed to understand mathematics, astronomy, hydraulics, the properties of different stones, and the behaviour of water in different temperatures and altitudes. They needed to understand the night sky well enough to cross-reference the water clock's reading with the star positions when checking accuracy. And they needed to wake up in the middle of the night every single night to do it. The water clock didn't announce itself. It didn't ring. It simply changed. The water level dropping, the reading moving, and if you were not there to read it, you didn't know what time it was, which meant the prayers didn't happen at the right moment, which meant the gods were not honoured correctly, which meant the entire cosmological order was, in principle, at risk. There is a particular kind of responsibility that comes from being the person between the world and its obligation to time. You are living a version of it on Pollard Street. Those priests lived a version of it in Wasset. The weight is recognisable across the 3,500 years between them. In Rome, several centuries later, the water clocks acquired bells. This was the breakthrough. The water clock was still the mechanism, but someone attached to it a system of weights and levers that, when the water reached a certain level, would release a mechanism that struck a bell or dropped a cascade of pebbles onto a metal plate. The auditory alarm, the first technology for waking a sleeping person at a specific time without requiring another person to do it. The most famous version of this is attributed to Ctesibius of Alexandria, a Greek engineer working in Egypt in the 3rd century BC, who is possibly the most underrated genius in the history of technology. Ctesibius invented a water clock with a float that rose as water filled the vessel, and the float was connected to a rack that turned a toothed wheel, and the toothed wheel moved the hands of a dial, and at preset positions on the dial, pins would trigger mechanisms that rang bells or released singing birds or opened curtains to reveal a figure that pointed at the hour. This was not just an alarm clock. This was a programmable, complex mechanical system built from water pressure and levers and toothed wheels, and it was built 2,300 years ago. Ctesibius. Remember that name. He's the grandfather of the whole lineage, the ancestor of Thomas Mudge's lever escapement, and the Seth Thomas factory in Connecticut, and the 2 and 6 penny alarm clock in the window of the clockmaker's shop on Oldham Street. He built the first thing that could wake a person without another person being there to wake them. The night is still long in Egypt when you first stand outside a temple and watch the priest with their clepsydra. The stars are enormous in the Egyptian sky. Nothing between you and them, no cold smoke, no gas lamps, just the pure dark and the river smell and the incredible, indifferent machinery of the heavens turning overhead. And somewhere in there, in the alignment of stars that the Egyptians have named and tracked and given divine identities, is information about what time it is, about where you are in the journey from sunset to sunrise, and the priest with the water clock is translating that information into practical guidance. It is time for the third ritual. It is time for the offering. It is time to wake the ones who need waking. Pull back from Egypt. Come forward 1,000 years to Rome. The Forum midday, the sundials everywhere, the shadow moving across the calibrated face, and in the shade of an arcade a water clock in a stone housing, tended by a freedman who was once a slave and is now a public employee, who manages the vessel and announces the hours to anyone who passes and wants to know. The Roman concept of the hora is different from yours. The Roman hour is 1/12 of the period of daylight, which means it changes with the seasons, means a summer hour is longer than a winter hour, means that the third hour means something different in December than it means in July. This variability was not considered a problem by the Romans. It was simply the nature of time, which tracked the sun rather than any abstract standard. The abstract standard would come much later, with the mechanical clock, which didn't care about the sun and gave you the same 60 minutes regardless of what the sky was doing. The fixed-length hour was the Industrial Revolution's contribution to human experience, the final severance of time from its natural referent. Before mechanical clocks, time breathed with the seasons. After it was fixed, uniform, identical from one end of the year to the other, immune to the actual behaviour of the universe, appropriate for a revolution that was trying to make human behaviour immune to the actual behaviour of the universe, to run factories on the same schedule in January and July, to produce goods at a rate determined by the market rather than the season, to turn human beings who are biological, seasonal, variable, into inputs that could be scheduled and deployed like any other factor of production. The mechanical clock was the ideology of the Industrial Revolution made manifest in metal and glass. This is not a metaphor. This is what historians of technology actually argue, with evidence, that the rise of mechanical timekeeping and the rise of industrial capitalism are not coincidental, that they are aspects of the same transformation of how human beings understood their relationship to time and their ability to control it. You're on Pollard Street at 3:30 in the morning with your bamboo pole, and you are a product of both traditions simultaneously. You're as old as the Egyptian priest with his stone bowl, doing the human work of standing between the world and its temporal obligations, and you are as new as the Industrial Revolution, doing that work in service of the factory schedule, which is the most extreme version of the demand for temporal precision that human civilization has ever created. That combination, that is what you are. Mrs. Hadfield understood this, even without the historical vocabulary for it. She understood it the way anyone understands something they've been doing for 28 years. Intuitively, in the body, in the specific ache of the pre-dawn cold, and the specific satisfaction of a round completed on time. She understood that what she was doing was not just a commercial service. It was something older. She had inherited a responsibility that had been passed from person to person across millennia. The responsibility for standing between sleeping humanity and the world's need for it to be awake. She started the trade because she had to. Her husband, James Hadfield, died of a chest infection in the winter of 1854 when she was 26 years old and their youngest child was 4 months old, and the rent was due in 3 weeks, and there was no mechanism by which a widow with an infant could find respectable employment quickly enough to make the rent. There was no savings. There was no family within travelling distance who could take them in. There was the question of what to do, which presented itself every morning with the clarity of something that will not wait for a better moment. She'd been doing informal wake-up rounds for 2 of her neighbours since before James died. The woman at number 6, who had to be at the laundry at 4:30, and the man at number 12, who worked an overnight bakery shift and needed waking at 2. She'd been doing it as a favour, for nothing, because they were neighbours and neighbours helped. After James died, she asked them if they'd pay for it. 2p each per week. They said yes. She asked 3 more neighbours. 2 said yes. She went a street further and asked 4 strangers. 3 said yes. Within 6 months, she had 14 clients and was making 7 shillings a week, which was less than James had made but more than she had expected. And she was managing the rent and the children's shoes and the coal and the food, managing it tightly, without slack, but managing it. Within 2 years, she had 40 clients and had taken on a second person to help with the rounds. Within 5 years, she had her first apprentice, though she didn't call him that. She called him her boy, the way you'd call anyone working for you their boy in that era. 28 years later, 2 of her children are grown and 2 have died, which is the arithmetic of childhood mortality in this city in this era, and her boy is you, the latest in a sequence of boys who have walked these streets with these poles in this dark, and the ledger is full, and the business is as close to secure as a business built on human beings need to be woken up can be. She's 54 years old. She has walked these streets in weather that would have stopped you cold, in fogs so thick you couldn't see the house across the road, in ice that made every step a managed fall, in heat, in wind, in the particular misery of Manchester rain that comes at you sideways and finds every gap in your clothing and soaks through 3 layers in 20 minutes. She's done this for 28 years. She has woken the same streets through 3 generations of mill workers. The people who are now grandparents were once the young workers she woke for their first shifts, and their children were woken by her, and now in some cases their grandchildren are on her list. This is legacy, not the sort that gets written about in newspapers or commemorated with plaques. The sort that exists in the actual lived texture of a community, in the fact that people get to work and earn wages and feed their children and keep their jobs, in the accumulated small dignities of not being perpetually late, of being the person who is reliable, who the employer can count on, who doesn't give the overlooker an excuse. She told you once, over the evening tea, that the thing she was most proud of in 28 years was not any single thing she'd done, but the fact that in 28 years she had never, not once, failed to complete the full round. She had done it sick. She had done it the morning after James died. She had done it with a broken toe she didn't know was broken until a doctor looked at it 2 weeks later and said, "This happened some time ago," and she said yes, about 2 weeks, and he looked at her as if she were slightly mad. She had done it in the pea-soup fogs of November when you genuinely could not see the lamp across the street and had to navigate by memory and touch, the brick walls of the houses guiding your hands from one window to the next. Never failed to complete the round. You feel the weight of this as a standard you're also being held to, whether or not it's stated explicitly. In 6 months, you have also never failed to complete the round. You've been sick twice, mildly. The kind of sick where your chest feels like it has something heavy in it, and your head is slightly too warm and you don't feel right, but not the kind of sick where you can't stand up and walk. You've done it in those conditions and been fine. You've come home and drunk tea and gone to bed and woken up the next afternoon feeling better, the way the young can afford to recover, the body's reserves not yet depleted. You will complete the round tomorrow night, and the night after, and the night after that, until the alarm clocks come down in price far enough to make you unnecessary. or until something else happens that you cannot currently predict, because the future is the same dark as the north-facing room, the same unknowable territory that everyone navigates by dead reckoning, using what they know about the direction they've been travelling and hoping the destination is somewhere reasonable. The medieval monks who built the first mechanical alarm clock mechanisms, the iron frames and the toothed wheels and the falling weights that struck bells at matins, they were solving the same problem you're solving. They were trying to remove the human error from the process of waking at a specific time. They were trying to make the waking reliable in a way that depended on mechanism rather than person, because mechanisms don't oversleep. Mechanisms don't get sick. Mechanisms don't get distracted by a conversation at a window, or lose track of the time while standing at the edge of a frozen canal. But mechanisms also cannot observe. They cannot see the child's face at the window. They cannot notice that Grace Marsden's candle takes longer each week. They cannot make the judgment call about John Hennessy and his brother-in-law, and when enough is enough, and when another word will just make things worse. The monks who built the first alarms were also, in their chapels, surrounded by human beings who did the observing. The sacristan who rang the alarm also watched the community, knew who was struggling, knew whose sleep was troubled, knew whose vocation was wavering and whose was strong. The mechanism did the waking, the human did the seeing. They were a system together, the mechanical and the human, each doing what the other couldn't. You are that system, compressed into a single person. You are both the alarm and the observer. You carry the pole and the wire, the mechanism part, and you carry the 6 months of accumulated knowledge about 47 people, the observing part, and both of these are necessary, and neither alone is sufficient. The alarm clock will take the mechanism part from you. It will not take the observing part, because that part has nowhere to go once the job disappears. It will simply cease to exist as a professional function. The knowledge will dissolve. There will be no one whose job it is to know that Grace Marsden's window has been coming up more slowly for 3 weeks. No one whose professional responsibility requires them to track the quality of each night's sleep for 47 different households. Something will be lost. Not irreplaceably, not devastatingly. Communities manage. Neighbours notice things. The woman at number 23 noticed that Mary Dooley was failing before you told her. The communities of industrial Manchester were not helpless or unknowing. They watched each other with the intense alertness of people who live at close quarters and depend on each other in ways that the comfortable classes, with their privacy and their space, do not need to. But something specific will be lost. The professional observer, the person whose job explicitly included knowing what was happening at these windows, the person who stood between the night and the morning as a human witness to the passage from one to the other, worth noting. Worth sitting with for a moment, in the pre-sleep dark, while the mill horns are sounding and the city is doing what cities do. Now let the notes sit. Now let the thinking slow. Now let the accumulated weight of the night's observations settle into the body the way the cold settles into the bones, except different, except more like the way warmth settles into the cold bones when you sit by a fire, the way it fills the gaps and the spaces and makes everything feel less angular and urgent than it did in the dark. 47 windows, 47 mornings given. Mary Dooley's daughter holding a candle too big for her hands with steadiness that belongs to someone 3 times her age. Thomas Ridley with his 3 fingers and his 4 children. Arthur Capper, already at the window, already lit. The alarm clock inside him so thoroughly calibrated to the night that the concept of sleeping through his wake time has become biologically impossible. Danny Heap, who is going to ask for a raise and probably won't succeed and will do it anyway, because at 20 years old you should still try things that probably won't succeed. Because the habit of trying is the thing you're building, not the individual outcome. Grace Marsden, whose candle comes more slowly each week. You will say something to Mrs. Hadfield about Grace Marsden tomorrow after you wake. Martha Booth, 32 years reaching into machinery, 2 fingers missing, never hesitating. What is it to do a thing for 32 years with that degree of competence and that degree of physical cost? What is it to know a job that well, and to have it cost you that much, and to keep showing up because the alternative is not showing up, and not showing up means something far worse than 2 fewer fingers? Alice Park with her careful arithmetic and her 3-penny negotiation, and the note through the letterbox rather than the conversation at the door, because she was embarrassed to ask in person, but not embarrassed enough to not ask, which is a very specific kind of courage. And Mrs. Hadfield, who walked these streets for 28 years and never once failed to complete the round, and who is probably asleep now herself, in her room at the front of the house, her ledger on the table downstairs, her own round finished hours ago, her body doing what bodies do after 28 years of this particular discipline, sleeping with the specific thoroughness of someone who has earned the rest and knows how to take it. Sleep is a form of trust. This is something you've been working out slowly since you started this job. When you sleep, you trust that the world will manage without you, that the city will keep running, that the things that need doing will be done by other people or will wait. You hand the world back for a few hours and trust it not to fall apart. This is the act of faith that most people perform without examining it, as naturally as breathing. You examine it, because your job is the mechanism by which other people can perform it. You are, in a small and practical way, the thing that makes it safe for your 47 clients to trust the world for 7 hours of darkness. And now it is your turn. Now the trust passes to you. The world will manage. Manchester will manage. The mills will operate. And the boilers will maintain pressure. And the cotton will move through the machines. And the money will move through the trade. And all of it will proceed in your absence. The ledger will be there when you wake. The pole will be in its rack. Mrs. Hadfield will have made new notes in her cramped handwriting. The clients will have made it through their shifts and come home and eaten whatever there was to eat, and gotten into their own beds and started their own journeys toward the sleep you are currently beginning. It is a system. It moves. You are part of it for 3 hours each night and separate from it for the rest. And the part of it you're separate from functions without your involvement, as it should, as any good system does. Let it function. Let the city run. Let the clocks tick, the water drip, the pendulums swing, the springs uncoil, the hands move around their faces. Let Thomas Mudge's lever escapement do its work in 1,000 mechanisms across this city, and every city like it, dividing time into its fine increments, counting the seconds of lives that don't need to be counted quite so precisely, but have been committed to precision because that is what the age demands. Let the age demand it. Let it demand all it wants. Right now you are not available for demands. Right now you're the body in the bed in the north-facing room. The body that walked 3 miles in the cold and tapped 47 windows and stood in the dark with a 14-foot pole and gave the morning to people who needed it. That body now has permission. Full, complete, unconditional permission to do nothing at all. The light in the curtain edge, the sounds of the city, fading, not fading because they're stopping. They're not stopping. Manchester doesn't stop. The carts and the voices and the machinery and the bells and the horns and the horses and the 1,000 overlapping sounds of 500,000 lives do not stop. But your relationship to them is changing. They are becoming background. They are becoming the wallpaper of a room you're leaving, the furniture of a place you no longer need to navigate. You are leaving, not going anywhere. Right here, in this bed, in this room, under these blankets, at this precise address in this particular city, in this particular year of this particular century. But also somewhere else, the somewhere that sleep takes you, that has no address and no clock, and no 47 names, and no cold, and no pole, and no wire on glass. The somewhere that every human being has been going to since before there were human beings, since before there were cities or clocks or priests with stone bowls or monks with iron bells. The somewhere that is older than consciousness. The somewhere that consciousness returns to every night, because it has to, because the body demands it, because the machine of thought and memory and feeling that makes you a person, rather than just an organism, requires periodic shutdown and maintenance, and the deep, complex work that only happens in the dark, in the quiet, in the space where you stop being responsible for anything. Egypt is dark. Rome is quiet. The monastery bell has finished its arc through the air, and the monks are shuffling toward the chapel, and the sacristan is settling back into his seat and checking the water clock and calculating when the next ring will be required. In Manchester, the mill horns have sounded and the shifts have started, and Arthur Capper is walking home through the morning streets, his long night finished, his face pointing toward the bed and the north facing dark, and you, warm enough, safe enough, done enough for today. The city will be here when you wake up. The ledger will be on the table. The pole will be in its rack. Mary Dooley, by the evening, we'll either be better or we'll need the doctor, and either way it will have happened without you. The way most things happen without any one of us. The way the world manages its own operations while we're occupied with our portion of them and not worrying about the rest. You don't have to worry about the rest. The same as last night. The same as every night before. The same as every night stretching out ahead. The long sequence of identical nights that will make up the rest of your time in this job, until the clocks come down in price and the ledger closes and the pole goes into a shed somewhere, and someone writes a brief paragraph about the knocker-up trade in a book about the Industrial Revolution, the way we document everything that has passed and become interesting in retrospect. But that's later. Right now, the only thing that matters is warm enough, safe enough, done. Take it. Take the rest. Let the city keep its noise. Let the clocks keep their time. Let the morning keep moving through its hours, dispensing daylight to the people who need it, running the machinery of the day. You are in the night now, in the private dark, in the place where time doesn't quite reach. Down, all the way down. Good night. But I haven't told you about the fog. If you're going to understand November in Manchester, if you're going to actually be here rather than just reading about being here, you need to know about the fog. Not the fog you might imagine from the word fog, the soft grey mist that makes the world look like a watercolour painting, and is actually rather romantic if you're looking at it from the right window. Not that fog. Manchester fog in November is something else. It is a specific phenomenon produced by the particular combination of factory smoke, river moisture, the geographical bowl that the city sits in between the Pennines to the east and the hills of Cheshire to the south, and the temperature inversions that occur when the cold air from the moors meets the warmer air rising from 100,000 coal fires and twice that many industrial chimneys. The result is something the Victorians call a pea souper, which is a description so accurate it's almost scientific. A fog the colour and approximately the consistency of pea soup, thick enough to make objects disappear at 15 feet, thick enough to taste when you breathe it, thick enough to feel on your skin as a film of cool, coal-flavoured dampness that settles into your coat and your hair and your eyelashes. The worst fog of the year you've been doing this round came in October, not November, which was unexpected. A Tuesday evening in mid-October when the factory smoke simply stopped going anywhere. The sky above the city sealed shut by a temperature inversion that sat there for 3 days without moving, and the smoke accumulated, and the coal from the domestic fires accumulated on top of the industrial smoke, and by Wednesday morning the visibility on Pollard Street was approximately 8 feet. You could see the house directly in front of you and the one on either side, and that was all. Beyond that, grey, thick, close, slightly luminous in the gas lamp light, like the gas lamp was trying to illuminate the inside of a cotton bale. You did the round in 8 feet of visibility. You've thought about how to explain this to someone who hasn't done it, and the honest answer is that you can't explain it fully, because the experience is primarily not visual. The fog takes your primary sense and reduces it to almost nothing, which means the job falls to your other senses. Sound, which carries differently in fog, muffled and close, your own footsteps coming back to you from the houses on either side as if the street has shrunk. Touch, because you've learned to use the pole not just for tapping windows but as a navigation tool in bad fog, holding it slightly ahead of you and to the right, letting the wire end brush the house fronts as you walk, feeling your way from one address to the next by the rhythm of doors and windows and the slightly different texture of the brick where the pointing between courses has worn differently. And memory, because in the end, what you're navigating by is the map of the round that you carry in your body. The distances between addresses measured not in feet, but in footsteps. The number of steps from number 14 to number 15 burned into your legs from 6 months of walking it. In the October fog, you did the round entirely by memory and by the feel of the houses under your hands. You didn't see a single window. What you saw were shapes, the slightly less grey shape of a window against the slightly more grey shape of brick wall, the smear of candlelight that told you the person inside was awake, diffused by the fog into something more like a glow than a point. You couldn't see faces. You couldn't confirm that the person at the window was who you expected. You simply tapped and moved and trusted that the person on the other side of the glass was the person whose window this was, which they always were, because no one in Pollard Street was in the habit of sleeping in a neighbour's bedroom. In the October fog, you came home 3 hours after you left and stood in Mrs. Hadfield's kitchen, and could not feel your hands and couldn't speak for about 2 minutes, not because anything dramatic had happened, but because the concentration required to navigate 3 miles of near-zero visibility, tapping 47 windows that you couldn't see, had used up some resource that needed replenishing before language was available again. Mrs. Hadfield looked at you and didn't say anything, just poured the tea and put it in front of you and sat down across the table and waited, which was exactly the right thing, which was the thing you've come to understand is her primary skill, knowing when to wait. You drank the tea. Your hands started to work again, and then she said, "Well done," and went back to her ledger. That's the whole conversation. Well done. 2 words for 3 hours of navigating blind through a coal fog in November. But they were the right words, and they were enough, because they came from someone who had done it herself for 28 years and knew exactly what they were worth. The fog lifted on Friday. The city blinked. slowly, like something coming out of a long sleep. The gas lamps visible from proper distances again, the houses across the street distinguishable from the ones behind them. You walk the round on Friday morning and the world had its edges back, and the specific relief of having edges back when you'd spent 3 days without them was extraordinary. The round took 20 minutes less than usual. You could see where you were going. The whole thing felt almost easy. Almost. It's never easy. That's one of the things you know now that you didn't know 6 months ago. Work that looks simple from outside is usually not simple from inside. The knocker-up trade looks like walk, tap, walk home. From outside it looks like it might be boring, or only slightly less boring than being a lamplighter, which is another job that sounds simple and is a different kind of complex. From inside it is the management of 47 relationships with sleep, conducted in the dark, in variable weather, with a body that has reversed its day and night cycles and has to perform consistently regardless of its preferences. Navigating a city whose behavior changes every night and whose obstacles, human and physical, are never precisely the same twice. There is a skill here. The skill is not visible to people who haven't needed it, the way the skill of a good waiter is not visible to anyone who's not in the service industry, the way the skill of a nurse is not visible to anyone who's not ill. It exists in the body, in the feet that know the distances, in the hands that know how hard to tap and when to escalate and when to move on, in the reading of faces behind glass that is something you couldn't have taught yourself without 6 months of repetition. The skill will disappear when the job disappears. This is also how skills disappear, not through any process of decision or documentation, but simply through the cessation of the practice that embodied them. Someone who knows how to make a specific type of medieval armor dies and doesn't teach anyone, and the knowledge goes with them. Someone who knows how to navigate a specific stretch of river without charts reads the currents with the same intuition they use to read a face. And when the charts are made and the engines replace the current reading, the river reading knowledge has no one to live in anymore. The knocker-up's knowledge will go the same way. There will not be a museum of this. There will not be a curriculum. There will be, for some years after the last knocker-up puts down their pole, a few old people in Manchester who remember being woken by one, who can describe the sound of the wire on the glass with the particular vividness of a sense memory, who can tell you exactly how many taps before the light came on, and what the candle looked like in the cold window, and whether it was cold enough to see the person's breath. And then those people will die, and that memory will go, and the trade will exist only in the paragraph in the book about the Industrial Revolution, worth knowing about while it still exists, worth understanding as something other than quaint. The other thing about the pre-dawn hours, the thing I haven't told you yet because it's harder to describe than the fog and the cold and the clients, is what happens to the mind. What the specific hours between 2 and 5 in the morning do to the way you think, the way associations form, the way the edges between things that are normally kept separate start to soften. Sleep scientists will later identify a phenomenon they call sleep inertia, the grogginess that comes from waking from certain stages of sleep, when the brain has not fully transitioned from sleep to wake, and is operating in a compromised state where memory is patchy and reasoning is unreliable, and the emotional processing circuits are unusually active. Sleep inertia explains why people make strange decisions immediately after waking, why they're more emotionally volatile, why they sometimes remember dreams as real events. You don't experience sleep inertia because you're not waking from sleep. You're in the small hours doing a job that requires full function. and you are fully functional. You have to be, but you experience something adjacent. The quality of thought that comes at 3 in the morning when you've been awake long enough that the ordinary mental housekeeping has been largely completed. When the daytime concerns have settled, when the social calculations that occupy the brain during waking hours have quieted because there's almost no one here to calculate about, and what's left is something less linear and more associative, the brain following connections that it normally wouldn't follow because the editorial function that keeps thinking tidy and goal-directed has relaxed. This is when you think about the Egyptian priests with their stone bowls. This is when you make the connection between the sacristan's bell and the wire spiral on the glass. This is when you stand at the edge of a frozen canal for 2 minutes and understand, without articulating it, that the city and the cold and the work and all of it are temporary in a way that is actually okay, in a way that doesn't require you to do anything about it. 3 in the morning has a specific quality of openness. Something is available in those hours that isn't available in the day, some clarity or some looseness in the mental fabric that lets through thoughts the daylight keeps out. Artists and writers and late-night mathematicians have always known this. The hours when the world is quiet and the social demands are minimal, and the mind can follow its own paths without being recalled every few minutes to the practical present. You have this every night as a byproduct of the job. You have the 3 in the morning mind as a professional benefit. The same way you have the view of the city waking up as a professional benefit. The same way you have the accumulated knowledge of 47 people's most private moments as a professional benefit. These are things the job gives you that are not on Mrs. Hadfield's rate card and do not appear in any ledger anywhere. They are in many ways the most valuable things the job gives you. Sleep is biological necessity. This is a fact, not an opinion, and it's a fact that the Victorian era was in the process of discovering in the hard way, the way civilizations discover most facts about human biology. By violating the need at industrial scale and observing the consequences, the factory system which drove people to work 12 and 14-hour days, which employed children, which ran night shifts that turned the working day into something that bore no relationship to the natural cycle of light and dark, was conducting a massive, uncontrolled experiment on the human body's capacity to function with insufficient sleep. The results of that experiment were increased accident rates, decreased productivity, elevated disease rates, shorter lives, and populations so chronically exhausted that their immune systems were suppressed, and their cognitive function was impaired in ways that were not recognized as sleep-related, because sleep science did not yet exist as a discipline. The 10-hour day movement, the 9-hour movement, the campaigns for the 8-hour day that will succeed by the end of the century were partly driven by morality, and partly by the pragmatic discovery that workers who sleep enough work better than workers who don't, that the short-term gain from extracting maximum hours from a workforce is offset by the long-term loss from workers who are chronically damaged by the extraction. This is not a compassionate discovery, it's an economic one. But it leads to the same practical outcome: more sleep for industrial workers, more time in the bed, more recovery, more possibility of doing the work without destroying the body doing it. You are, in a small and specific way, part of that story. The knocker-up trade exists to make it possible for the workers to get every minute of sleep between their shifts that they can. You don't come at midnight. You come as late as possible while still leaving enough time to get dressed and to the factory gate before it closes. You don't come earlier than you have to. You come at the last moment that makes the morning possible, because every minute before that moment is a minute of sleep, and every minute of sleep is a minute of recovery, and a minute of recovery is worth more. in the economy of working-class lives, then a penny, then a shilling, then many things that cost much more. Thomas Ridley gets 55 minutes of warning before his shift starts. 55 minutes from wake to factory gate, which allows for getting dressed, making and eating whatever constitutes breakfast in the Ridley household, walking the distance from his house to Murray's Mill, and arriving with enough time to not be late. 55 minutes is the minimum. You wake him at 4:15 for a 5:10 start. Every minute earlier would be a minute of sleep lost. Every minute later would risk the docking. You've calibrated this with Mrs. Hadfield over 6 months. 2 minutes later for Thomas Ridley would be acceptable on good days, risky on days when he oversleeps his initial response. 2 minutes earlier would be a gift of time you're not authorized to steal from him. The calibration is a form of care. It's the care that says, I have thought about your specific situation and your specific needs, and I have adjusted my behavior accordingly, not because the contract requires me to, but because it's right. Martha Booth gets 6 minutes more than she needs. Mrs. Hadfield's note on Martha Booth says, give her extra time in winter. She layers up and has trouble with the buttons. Don't make her rush. Martha Booth is 61 years old and has been at the mill for 48 years and has 2 missing fingers and buttons that are difficult. And Mrs. Hadfield's calibration of her wake time accounts for all of this, without Martha Booth having to say anything about it. That's the human intelligence that the alarm clock cannot replicate. The clock rings when it's set. It doesn't know about buttons. It doesn't know about the winter, or the arthritis that's making the winter harder than the summer, or the accumulated difficulties of a 61-year-old body that has been doing hard physical work for 48 years and needs a little more time in the morning than it used to. The clock rings. That's all. It's enough for most purposes. It will be enough when it comes. But you're right to know, right now, what is being lost when it comes. The history of sleep across human civilizations is a history of interruption. Interrupted by predators, by cold, by hunger, by illness, by the demands of children, by the demands of gods, by the demands of employers. The evolutionary history of sleep before civilization made it complicated is not straightforwardly restful either. We evolved in environments where predation was a genuine risk, where sleeping too deeply in the wrong place could end you, and our sleep is still structured by this, still segmented into phases that allow for a degree of responsiveness to environment that pure deep sleep would prevent. There's an interesting historical theory proposed by a historian called Roger Kirsch that before the Industrial Revolution, people in Western cultures did not sleep in a single block of 7 or 8 hours the way we try to. They slept in 2 segments, a first sleep and a second sleep, divided by an hour or so of wakefulness in the middle of the night. This middle of the night waking was not insomnia. It was normal. People would lie in bed and think, or get up and read by candlelight, or visit neighbours, or have sex, or pray, or simply rest in a state of quiet wakefulness before drifting back to sleep for the second half of the night. Medical texts from the period recommended the interval between first and second sleep as a good time for sex because the body was relaxed and the mind was receptive. Poets wrote about it. Diaries mentioned it as a matter of fact, the way they might mention having lunch. This pattern, if Kirch is right, was disrupted by the artificial light of the industrial era. When you could extend the day with gas lamps and candles, when the social evening extended past the point at which darkness had previously ended it, people stayed up later and compressed their sleep into a single block, and the natural two-phase pattern was lost, replaced by the continuous single sleep that everyone now considers normal and experiences the absence of as pathological. You don't know this theory. Roger Kirsch hasn't yet written his book, but you know something related to it from experience. The specific quality of the hour between your client's first sleep and the moment you wake them is different from the rest of the night. At around 3 in the morning, the city goes through something that isn't quite silence but is the closest to it. The pub goers are home and asleep. The night soil men are between pickups. The police constables are on their rounds but haven't had reason to be vocal about it. The factories are quiet. Even the animals in the stables are in the deepest part of their own sleep. And in this window you are walking through a city that is, briefly, in what might be its second natural sleep, the deep one, the one that comes after the middle of the night wakefulness that the gas lamps and the factory schedule and the compacted working day have mostly eliminated, but which the body still perhaps tries to achieve. You are waking people out of that deep sleep. That's why it's hard. That's why Thomas Ridley is difficult. That's why 3 taps sometimes isn't enough. You are arriving in the deepest hour, the most committed hour, the hour when the body is most thoroughly committed to unconsciousness, and you are asking it to reverse course. No wonder it resists. You've learned not to take it personally. You've learned that the resistance at the window, the slow face, the eyes not yet inhabited, is not reluctance to do the job or ingratitude for being woken or any judgment on you or your services. It is simply biology. The body doing what bodies do in the depths of the night, and you doing what you do, which is make the morning available anyway. The morning is always available. That's the thing. No matter how deep the sleep, no matter how dark the night, no matter how cold the street or thick the fog or heavy the body, the morning comes. It comes the same. The sun does its thing on the other side of the earth, and eventually the sky goes from black to dark blue to grey to gold, and the city, pulled by the same rhythms as the Egyptian priests and the Roman water clock keepers and the medieval sacristans and every other version of this story, the city wakes up. It just needs a little help sometimes. It just needs someone standing in the cold with a bamboo pole, holding the moment between sleep and morning long enough for the sleeping world to collect itself and make the crossing. That's you. That was you tonight, and tomorrow night, and every night until the clocks come down in price and the mechanism takes over from the person, the way mechanisms always do, but not tonight. Tonight was yours. Tonight you walked the round and gave them the morning and came home and made the tea and lay down in the north-facing room, and now you're in the place that the job earns you. The place that makes the job worth doing, the dark, the good dark. The dark that is yours, that no one will disturb until 2 in the afternoon. That is the payment the night makes to the person who agreed to be awake in it. Let it be dark, let it be quiet. Let the city with its mills and its bells and its fog and its horses and its Mary Dooleys and its Arthur Cappers and its frozen canals do what it does. You have done your part. The part that is left is the oldest part. The part that needs no clock and no mechanism and no bamboo pole. The part that the body knows before the mind knows anything at all. Sleep. Take it. It's been there waiting for you all morning. Good night. There is one more thing. One more piece of this history that belongs in the dark between the closing of your eyes and the full arrival of sleep. A piece that lives in the gap between the mechanical and the human, between the clock and the person who wakes you. It's about candles, about a very specific way that people across multiple civilizations tried to solve the problem of waking at a specific time before they had either knocker-uppers or mechanical clocks, and it is both brilliant and absurd in equal measure, which is a combination I find very consoling at 3 in the morning. The candle clock. Take a candle. Mark it at intervals. Burn it from the top. Each interval represents a unit of time, measured not by the movement of water through a hole, but by the consumption of wax at a predictable rate. Light the candle when you go to bed. Set something at the appropriate mark. A pin pushed horizontally through the wax at the interval you want to wake up, balanced across a shallow metal bowl so that when the flame reaches the pin and the wax around it melts, the pin drops into the bowl with a small metallic clatter. Not a loud noise, a modest noise, enough, if you're a light sleeper, to pull you out of sleep, enough, theoretically, to give you the signal you need. Alfred the Great, King of Wessex in the 9th century, is said to have used candle clocks to regulate his day, though the story comes from a biography written well after his death, and may be partly legend, the way most good administrative stories from the 9th century are partly legend. He divided his 24 hours into 3 8-hour blocks, one for sleep, one for government and scholarship, one for prayer and physical exercise. To ensure these divisions were maintained, he used candles of a standardized length and weight, burned in lanterns to protect the flame from drafts. His household maintained the candles, replaced them at the right intervals, adjusted for wind and temperature, and the slightly different burn rates of different batches of wax. Alfred the Great was, in this respect, employing his own household as knocker-uppers. The people who maintained his candle clocks were the sacristan's counterparts in the secular world, responsible for the continuity of time measurement, responsible for the transitions between the day's phases, responsible for waking the king at the moment his sleep block ended and his government block began. Every human civilization has had this person, this keeper of time's transitions, the person whose specific responsibility was to know when the hour had turned and to make that knowledge available to everyone else. In ancient China, the duty of announcing the hours fell to watchmen, who walked the city at night striking a wooden drum at each hour, the rhythm changing to indicate which hour. 3 strikes for midnight, 4 for the first watch, and so on. The city organised by percussive timekeeping in the dark. In medieval Japanese cities, the fire watchmen who patrolled against the constant risk of fire in wooden cities also called the hours, announcing them with clappers and cries as they walked. In Islamic cities, the muezzin's call to prayer was partly a religious obligation and partly a timekeeping service. The 5 calls organising the day's structure for the entire community, regardless of whether they had their own clocks. In every case, a person, walking, ringing, striking, calling. A human body moving through the sleeping world, carrying the knowledge of what hour it was and distributing it to the people who needed it. You are in that lineage, not metaphorically, literally. You are the direct descendant, functionally, of every person who has ever walked through a sleeping city to tell it what time it was. The drum in the Chinese night, the clappers of the Japanese fire watchman, the voice of the muezzin in the mosque tower, the bell rope in the sacristan's hands, the wire spiral on your pole, different tools, same job, same function in the human social organism, the person who carries time so that everyone else can sleep. The thing about candle clocks that I find endearing, and I hope you do too as you drift towards sleep, is their reliance on consistency. A candle clock works only if the candles burn at a consistent rate, which they do if they're made of consistent quality wax, burned in consistent conditions, protected from drafts, kept at a consistent temperature. All of those conditions are difficult to guarantee in a real medieval household, which is why candle clocks were more useful as approximate guides than as precise instruments, why Alfred's division of his day into 3 blocks worked in principle, even if the specific moment of transition was subject to the variability of a flame in a stone corridor at night. But the principle is there. The principle is, take something that changes at a predictable rate and use the change to measure time. Water dripping, wax burning, sand falling, the pendulum swinging, the spring uncoiling. All of these are the same idea in different materials, all of them exploiting the consistency of a physical process to create the illusion of time's measurability. Time itself doesn't change at a consistent rate. Time is weirder than that. Time, as physicists will eventually demonstrate, bends near mass, slows near velocity, is not the smooth uniform medium that the clockmaker's instruments assume. But for the practical purposes of waking up before your mill shift starts, you don't need to worry about relativistic time. You need a mechanism that gives you approximately the same answer in December as in June, in Manchester as in Manchester, at altitude and at sea level within the same city. For these purposes, the candle clock is perfectly functional, the pendulum clock is exquisite, the alarm clock is sufficient. What they all share, the attempt to translate the experience of duration into something measurable, countable, communicable, to take the flow of time, which is felt but not seen, which you can experience but cannot point at, and give it a form that can be shared between people. That means the same thing to the person building the candle and the person sleeping beside it, that turns the subjective experience of duration into an objective standard. This is why time is so political, why the control of timekeeping has always been connected to power. Who sets the standard? Whose clock is correct? In medieval Europe, the church controlled time through the canonical hours and the bells that announced them, which meant the church controlled the rhythm of daily life. The secular powers, the guild masters and the merchants and the town councils gradually asserted their own claim to time by building civic clocks, clock towers in public squares that announced the hours according to the town's own reckoning rather than the church's. The factory owners of the Industrial Revolution asserted the next claim, the factory clock, whose time was law within the factory walls, and which could be and sometimes was deliberately set fast by unscrupulous owners to extract extra minutes of labour from workers who had no other clock to check against. There are documented cases of factory owners having 2 clocks. One, the public-facing clock on the tower that showed the correct time. One, in the foreman's office set 5 minutes fast, used to dock workers who arrived at what they thought was on time, but was, according to the office clock, late. Legal in 1882. Normal. Not challenged effectively until the labour movement grew strong enough to make it embarrassing. The power to set the time is the power to define the terms of the day. Mrs. Hadfield's rate card is, in a tiny way, a counterpower. By charging less than the cost of being late, by making it possible for the workers to be reliably on time by the employer's clock, she is giving them agency within the system that they couldn't otherwise have. She's not challenging the system. She's not making political arguments about who owns the hours. She's just doing the arithmetic of her clients' lives and charging accordingly. But the effect is real. Thomas Ridley is on time because of Mrs. Hadfield's ledger. He is not docked. His children have boots because he is not docked. The causal chain from the ledger to the boots is real and traceable and runs through every tap of your pole on every window of every night. Small power, human power, the kind that doesn't get written about in histories of the labour movement, but is present in the actual texture of working-class survival in the industrial north, the kind you carry in your hands on a bamboo pole, and this is where the night ends, not with a ceremony or a conclusion, with the particular flatness of something that has been done and doesn't need anything more said about it. The round is complete. The clients are at their work. Mrs. Hadfield's fire is banked in the kitchen below. The north-facing room has its curtain drawn and its crack in the ceiling and its thin blanket, and the soft sound of the city coming through the walls like water through the stone, present and ignorable. Your feet hurt, not badly. The particular dull ache of 3 miles of cobblestones in boots that are adequate but not generous, the kind of ache that will be gone by the time you wake, absorbed back into the general condition of a young body that heals quickly and recovers well. Your hands are warm now, finally tucked inside the blanket, no longer objects of concern but simply parts of the body that are doing what they should. The tiredness is complete, not overwhelming, not crushing, just done. The resource is spent. There's nothing left that wants to be anything other than horizontal and unconscious. The body has made its final statement on the subject of the night, and the statement is, enough. We're done here. Let the rest follow. Let the rest follow. The church bell somewhere. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. 8 o'clock in the morning. 500,000 people committed to their day. The mill's running. The horses moving. The markets opening. The ordinary, extraordinary, continuous life of a city that has been here for centuries and will be here for centuries more, changing beyond recognition in every generation, remaining recognizably itself through all of it. 500,000 lives, and underneath all of them, threaded through all of them, the same need: rest, recovery, the nightly return to the dark and the silence and the somewhere that has no name and no clock. The need that doesn't change with the technology or the decade or the century. The need that the priest with the stone bowl honoured just as surely as the foreman who docked a quarter day's pay honoured it in the negative. The need that you have been, in your small and specific way, protecting every night for 6 months. The window, the wire on the glass, the light behind the glass, moving. That's all it has to do. Just move toward you. Just let you know it's there. You'll do the rest. You'll step back. You'll make the mark in your head. You'll move on to the next one, and the one after, and the 45 ones after that. And then you'll come home, and you'll have tea. And you'll be in this room with this ceiling and this curtain and these sounds outside, and you'll sleep. The same as tonight. The same as last night. The same as every night that has been, and every night that will be. The long sequence of nights that make up a life. The nights that are the other half of the days. The necessary dark that the light requires. The rest that the work requires. The sleep that the waking requires. You've earned yours. Take it now. All the way. Down past the thinking. Down past the remembering. Down past the names and the windows and the wire on the glass and the quality of the darkness and the sound of the city and the weight of the blankets and the feeling of the pillow and all of it. All of the material fact of this moment in this room, in this city, in this year. Down past all of that, to where it's quiet, to where it's dark, to where nothing is required of you, and everything is possible, and the morning is a long way away, all the way down. Good night. In the spring, something changes. It's not dramatic. It's not the kind of change that announces itself. It's more like the way the light changes at the end of a very long tunnel. Not a sudden brightness, but a gradual reduction of the darkness, a slow increase in visibility that you notice only in retrospect, looking back at where you were and realizing you can see the distance you've travelled. In March, the mornings start to arrive earlier. Not early enough to matter in the schedule, not early enough to change when you need to be at window 1, but early enough that by the time you reach number 35 or so, the sky to the east has begun to develop that particular prenatal quality, the not yet light that is different from the no light of deep night. The birds notice it first, as they always do. Some mechanism in the bird brain, keyed to the angle of light rather than the presence of it, triggers them earlier in spring than in winter, and by March you're walking your last 10 clients to the sound of bird song that wasn't there in November. Blackbirds mostly, which is appropriate because the blackbird is one of the earliest singers, its song carrying in the cold air before there's any warmth to carry it. The bird song changes the round. It sounds ridiculous when you try to explain it to Mrs. Hadfield, who listens with the patient expression of a woman who has heard all kinds of things from young people who are in the middle of discovering things she discovered 30 years ago, but it changes it. The silence that the winter round happens in is a different kind of work from the work done in birdsong. The silence is total, absolute, just you and the pole and the city and the dark. The birdsong adds a layer that is not an intrusion but is a reminder. There is a world that is not dependent on the factory schedule. There is a world that runs on different information and different timings and finds the March morning beautiful in ways that have nothing to do with the 5:30 horn. You stand, number 42's window lit behind you, and listen to a blackbird doing its full morning performance somewhere on a chimney stack you can't see, and you think, this bird has no alarm clock and no knocker-up and no ledger and no rate card, and it wakes at precisely the moment its biology has determined for it, no earlier and no later, and the precision of it is extraordinary and the simplicity of it is extraordinary. And you are both envious and aware that this envy is a luxury because you are a person rather than a bird, and persons have obligations that birds don't have, and that's fine, that's correct, that's what persons are. But the bird is still beautiful. The summer round is completely different from the winter one, and you should know this before you settle into sleep, because the summer round is where this job reveals its strangest face. In summer, the sky is already light when you start. Not full light, not daylight properly, but past the darkness of winter, past the darkness of now. By late June, by midsummer, when you start at 2:30, the sky to the east is already a deep blue rather than a true black, already beginning the long, long transition to sunrise that summer mornings allow. By 3:30, when you're halfway through the round, the sky is lightening perceptibly. By 5, when you're done, it is fully, completely, undeniably morning. Bright morning, the sun already well above the horizon, the streets already lit by natural light as well as the gas lamps. The summer round, you've discovered, feels easier. The light helps. The body, with its deep preferences for operating in daylight rather than in darkness, finds the lighter mornings more agreeable than the pitch dark of November, even though the temperature is often warmer in November than you'd expect, and the summer mornings can be cold in their way, the specific cool of a summer night that has had no chance to warm up before you're out in it. But it also feels stranger, because in summer, you're not the only one out. The pre-dawn city in summer is not as empty as the pre-dawn city in winter. People sit on doorsteps in the last of the night's cool. Children, for reasons that are not always clear, are sometimes awake and playing in the spaces between houses at 3 in the morning, The exhausted, past-tired children who have gotten to the other side of sleep and come out still going. Couples returning from somewhere, their voices carrying in the warm air, laughing about something, alive to the night in a way that the winter rarely inspires. You tap summer windows into this context of partial wakefulness, and the responses are different. Faster, often. The summer night is lighter, and the sleeping is shallower, and the bodies are closer to the surface of consciousness than in winter. You tap once and the light comes. You tap once and the window opens. The summer round goes faster than the winter, 1 by 20 minutes on average, which gives you a different kind of morning afterward, one where it is properly, completely day by the time you get home, where you go to bed in daylight and pull the curtain tight against a sun that doesn't care about your schedule. The summer curtain, the heavy one that Mrs. Hadfield sewed herself from double-thickness wool left over from something she doesn't explain, hung specifically to block the summer morning light that would otherwise make sleeping after 6 impossible. Without the curtain, the summer bedroom at 6:15 would be brighter than the kitchen at noon in winter. With it, the north-facing room achieves something close to darkness. Not winter darkness, not the complete dark, but enough. Enough to let the body believe it is night. Let the melatonin systems do what they need to do. Let the sleep come. The body is credulous in this specific respect. Tell it darkness and it believes darkness. Tell it the right sounds and it believes night. The curtain and the quiet are a lie told to the circadian system, a lie the circadian system accepts because it has to, because the job requires it, because the adjustment has been made and the body has recalibrated, and now it sleeps when the curtain is drawn, regardless of what the sun is doing outside. Credulous and adaptable. This is the human body. This is what makes it possible to do this job and live in this city and follow a schedule that is entirely contrary to the one evolution built you for. The body doesn't argue. It adjusts. It finds the new equilibrium. It complains sometimes in the way bodies complain, with aches and poor concentration and the specific greyness of insufficient sleep in the winter months when the adjustment doesn't quite work. But it adjusts, and you adjust, and the 47 clients adjust in their way to the life of people who are woken before they're ready by the wire on the glass, who have built their lives around the certainty that someone will come to their window and give them the morning whether they want it or not, which is a strange thing to build your life around, but is also, perhaps, the most reliable thing in it. More reliable than the weather, more reliable than the mill owner's temper, more reliable than the price of coal or the quality of the cotton or any of the other variables that industrial life subjects you to without apology. The knock on the window, 2p a week, always on time, always there. That's the trade. That's the whole thing, really. The whole of what this job is and what it means and what it does in the world. The knock on the window, the light behind the glass, the morning given, over and over, until the clocks are cheap enough that no one needs it anymore. And then, the memory of the knock, the way it used to sound, the wire spiral on the glass, the very particular sound that is the sound of a city that relied on a person to wake it up, that trusted a 19-year-old boy from Cheshire with the 14 feet of bamboo and the 47 names in the ledger to make the morning available one window at a time. The memory will last longer than the trade. Memories of sounds always do. You can hear it now if you listen carefully at the very edge of sleep, the wire on the glass, faint, getting fainter, the city settling, the night doing what night does when it's finally allowed to just be itself without someone moving through it with a pole and a list. Just dark, just quiet. Just the long, still, restorative dark that is the only payment that matters at the end of a night's work. Take it, you've earned it. Good night.